Welcome. Tonight, a special report on Dude News.
Depuis qu'il est parti, je n'ai pu me relever. Ce n'est plus qu'un souvenir, une larme du passé, coincée dans mes yeux, qui ne veut plus s'en aller. Oh non, n'oubliez pas, vous qui
Hi guys, welcome to Dudes Brewing. Here for a special report on the state of affairs in Iran with the protests that have been ongoing since the unfortunate passing of Mahsa Amini. Now it's a subject I've been longing to speak about because I have a different, unique perspective on the situation in Iran. I am considered an outsider to some degrees. I think I've met quite a few Iranians over the last maybe 14 years or so. And from that connection, people tend to look at me and they assume that I might be half Iranian or I'm part Iranian. And I'm actually, I'm African, but like of Nigerian and French descent. Spanish. It's very mixed up, but yeah, so I am a complicated cluster of cultures, but I've been connected to Iranian people for quite a while. I was introduced to Iranian people from traveling and moving abroad, initially in Australia. And so I came into contact with predominantly, these were mostly Baha'is that I was in contact with. And so I've had a unique experience. I was able to meet Iranian Baha'is. I had the pleasure of meeting Iranian Muslims. I've also met Iranian Jews. So I've met quite an eclectic group of people from multiple backgrounds, multiple different variants of religious upbringings that influence their culture. Iran is very unique in the aspect of that geographically where they're located. They've had so many different forms of influence that have came through that sector of earth, because it's dead set center in the Middle East. So that's with regime changes, different dynasties that might have come through. So that's during the period of the Mongols. At one point, the Mongolian Empire had ruled over Iran. Initially, they had their own empire. They had the Persian Empire. Prior to that, they had Arabs that had controlled Iran, and also the Ottoman Empire, which are Turks. So the space of that country has been very unique in itself, that they've kind of gone through a massive amount of just different cultures and clashes that have passed through and that have also uniquely influenced this place. And it's got such a deep, rich history, long-standing from, I would say, BC. And for some people, if they're Christian, they'll say biblical days or however you want to put it. But the history is very, very unique. It's one of the oldest cultures on Earth, that has a substantial influence on our planet. So with Iran, with the recent protests that have been going on and been taking place, me as an African American, I feel a deep connection for Iran, and that's also partially due to people that I've met and I've come in contact with that I had the pleasure of meeting, but also me growing up in America. I felt like a natural born refugee, being born in a country where I was sort of considered unwanted. And a lot of African Americans tend to feel that way, that we are sort of just lost in translation, and in a lot of ways we were human trafficked and placed into America. And so with Iran, that's one of the first cultures that I've came in contact with, where I was able to see ideally how a traditional family or family structure should exist. In my upbringing, I would say since the 1960s in civil rights, African Americans long for inclusion, and that was due to Martin Luther King, the protests that took place at that time, and a lot of those protests were exploited by outside groups that sought to find a new way to sometimes hinder their own persecution by co-opting our struggle as Africans and deciding to support it, but supporting it under the management that they oversaw, the NAACP, different civil rights groups that may have came up and that were birthed out of the civil rights movement, which seemed like African Americans were in control of it. But if you look at the origins of a lot of these groups, African Americans haven't had much influence involved in that.
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolence. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's just the American white man.
Yes, so what I'm trying to say is it's a dangerous game when you look for outside entities to come in and try to negotiate or have control or influence over your people and wanting outside help. With a deep lesson that I think is very important that I want to point out is that when you live for inclusion, you're at the mercy of your oppressor. So with African Americans, we strive to be included in some regards. Martin Luther King wanted us to fit in to America. Malcolm X, on the other end, sought the importance of us reconnecting with Africa.
We feel that the problem, number one, of the black man in America is beyond America's ability to solve. It's a human problem, not an American problem or a Negro problem. And as a human problem or a world problem, we feel that it should be taken out of the jurisdiction of the United States government and the United States courts and taken into the United Nations in the same manner that the problems of the black man in South Africa, Angola, and other parts of the world, and even the way they're trying to bring the problems of the Jews in Russia into the United Nations because of violation of human rights. We believe that our problem is one not of violation of civil rights, but a violation of human rights. Not only are we denied the right to be a citizen in the United States, we're denied the right to be a human being.
And us being able to establish and be able to take care of our own. Unfortunately, the country took the direction of Martin, and I don't mean that lightly, because since then, we've been living to feel included in America. So on a year-by-year basis, we're constantly begging to be included. We're begging to be not discriminated against. And unfortunately, that has played a very powerful part in keeping us suppressed and underneath needing to turn to other people for us to feel validated or to feel important. Yeah, we've been at the mercy of the United States since that point. And so what I'm trying to say is to conclude in that comparison regarding civil rights and what those protests mean and what the outcome of it turned out to be. Because our civil rights movement ended because of the women's liberation movement, which ended up splitting African American men from African American women, and it became about fighting behind genders and polarizing our differences. And we started civil rights out as a complete family, and it ended because of men versus women.
What the welfare system and other kinds of governmental programs are doing is paying people to fail. Insofar as they fail, they receive the money. Insofar as they succeed, even to a moderate extent, the money is taken away. This is even extended into the school systems, where they will give money to schools with low scores. Insofar as the school improves its education, the money is taken away, so that you are subsidizing people to fail in their own private lives and become more dependent upon the handouts.
We have expectations built in today about the quality of life, the quality of job, the level of income for which one expects in return Why? Because we look at the level around us that it takes us to have
No,
a
that's not
fairly
why.
decent level.
No, that's not why. I may have all sorts of expectations. The question is, what can I do? If someone else is subsidizing my expectations will be far higher. Insofar as the Center for Advanced Study was subsidizing my expectations a few years ago, I refused to work at UCLA for the normal full professor's salary. Why should I when I can get the same money for being at the Center for Advanced Study with no hours, no duties, and no classes?
I think it is overly broad to say that we turn people into helpless children.
I don't remember talking to anyone who's ever been on welfare who didn't think they were being treated like children while they were on it.
Decent living.
The man in the house rule was written to prevent welfare cheating, to make sure that aid to families with dependent children would go only to families headed by mothers. But the effect of the man in the house rule is to create for children an atmosphere of investigation and surveillance. And thus, the welfare system in its operation turns out to be a system to make life harder for children.
The welfare system helps the disintegration of the American family. It offers money to families if the fathers will leave them and stay away, in that sense undoing the very stability of the family and taking away one of the two parents that children, of course, need. And what I have seen, I'm afraid to say, all over the country is that the legal system works against the best kind of home for these children.
Unfortunately, that is what I'm seeing taking place with what's occurring in Iran. And it's true that Iranian women want freedom, they want liberty, they want to have the ability to have, to live their lives in dignity. However, that has been exploited in a number of ways. And that's been an ongoing theme in Iran since 1908 with William Knox and his decision to come into Iran and try to exploit them through their ability to be able to extract oil. Given it's true that Iran didn't have the technology at the time to be able to extract the oil, but he promised concessions and a certain percentage of finances to go back to Iran, and he didn't stick to that agreement.
In 1901, the British businessman and millionaire William Knox D'Arcy decided to start a new venture. He set out to look for oil in Iran. He offered the Shah of Iran a deal. If D'Arcy found any oil in Iran, he owns them. And in exchange, the Iranian government would get 20,000 pounds in cash, 20,000 pounds in stocks, and only 16% of the future profits. Discovering oil in your own country would be a gold mine. So for any government with a bit of self-respect, this would be a ridiculously bad deal. But since Iran's government doesn't have the know-how to drill for oil, the Shah had no choice but to agree. 16% of something is better than 100% of nothing after all. And all that money would go straight into the Shah's pockets so he could live an even more luxurious life. After the deal was made, D'Arcy hired a geologist to search for oil in the Iranian desert. But it wasn't the cozy adventure they had imagined. Smallpox raged, bandits and warlords freely roamed the desert. There was little to no fresh water, and the devastating heat of the Iranian desert didn't make the job any easier. Years went by without finding a single drop of oil, and D'Arcy's fortune started to shrink. By 1908, D'Arcy had sunk more than 500,000 pounds into his risky venture. Even for a multimillionaire, that's a huge investment, and it looked like it wasn't going to pay off. So D'Arcy decided that it was time to pack the bags and leave Iran. He sent a message to his geologist, telling him that he was running out of money and that he needs to abort the mission. But his geologist wasn't ready to give up yet, so he ignored the message and kept going. And only a few days later, in a last-ditch effort, he finally struck oil. Suddenly, D'Arcy was the sole owner of a vast ocean of oil. And thanks to the deal he made with the Shah, no one else was allowed to drill or sell Iranian oil except for him. And he was set to be richer than his wildest dreams. On April 14, 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born. And the shipping of Persian oil products began in 1913 from their new refinery in Abadan. As Iranian oil production ramped up, the British Empire started enjoying a new era of immense wealth. But the Iranian people, they were still dirt poor. Even the oil workers at the Abadan refinery were still dirt poor. They were paid 50 cents a day and had to live in a shanty town. They were surrounded by mud, stagnant water, and biting flies without clean water or electricity. These hard-working Iranians were literally giving away the country's most precious resource to the British, basically for free, while they were living in devastating poverty.
L'immense majorité vivait dans ce que nous appelons en France des bidonvilles. Alors, les conditions d'existence de ces ouvriers étaient absolument incroyables. Et surtout, on savait que l'Angleterre, c'est-à-dire la compagnie, gagnait de l'argent énormément.
بهترین منازل، بهترین اسفالت، همه تو این بریم همه انگلیسا و اینجا تو خونه گیلی بودیم زمان انگلیسا.
شرممش که بخوام بگم اگرم تو روی یه ایرانی میخندیدن مثل این که تو روی یه حیوان میخندن.
They were treating them kind of like the way we treated black Americans in pre-Civil War South, or even post-Civil War South, when we put them in economic slavery instead of real slavery.
Fast forward to 1913, shortly before World War I, and Winston Churchill was facing a problem. For one, he wanted to modernize Britain's Royal Navy and get rid of all of the ships that were still running on coal. But another problem was the British's dependence on Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's American oil empire. The British government wanted to turn the Anglo-Persian Oil Company into their own oil empire so they wouldn't have to rely on the Americans. And with World War I just around the corner, they didn't have any time to waste. So the government bought 51% of the shares in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, making them the controlling power behind the oil company. Now with the British government calling the shots and a world war going on, the British oil business started booming. During the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the British Empire was fueled by Iranian oil. British cars, trucks, and factories all ran on cheap Iranian oil. The Royal Navy powered its ships with Iranian oil.
حتی یک لوله 4 اینچ 5 اینچ کشیده بودن از زیر رودخانه کارون هدایت میکردن به اون طرف به عراق بنزین مجانی برای مصارف خودشون و نیروی دریایی انگلیس و غیره اونجا مصرف میکردن.
And the Iranians? They didn't even get their measly 16% cut. The British government paid them a pitiful £47,000 while they made millions from their oil. It was one of the most ruthless and one-sided deals in the history of business. And Winston Churchill later wrote, "Fortune brought us a prize from fairyland beyond our wildest dreams."
The oil coming from Iran brought millions in revenue to the British Treasury.
Under the original agreement, only about 16% of the oil revenue was supposed to be given to Iran. But that 16% was going to be calculated by the British, and no Iranian would be allowed to look at the books. We now know also that the amount was calculated after the oil company paid its taxes. Now, the oil company was owned by the British government, so when it was paying taxes, it was essentially paying taxes to itself. So it was a lot of creative accounting, but in the end, it was clear that almost all the money from this tremendous resource was going into Britain, and almost none was coming back to Iran.
But this ruthless deal was leading to some tension. Iran's Shah, or king, Reza Pahlavi, was a tough military man who ruled over Iran with an iron fist, and he could no longer accept how the British were exploiting his country. He demanded a better deal for Iran's oil, but the British were quite happy with the contract and simply stalled negotiations, until the Shah threatened to cancel it. As a result, the British made a concession. They agreed to pay about £1 million a year, and since the Shah didn't like the name Persia, they also changed the company's name to Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Iran had finally gotten something out of the deal, but it was still a slap in the face. Just £1 million a year for the billions of dollars the British oil company would continue to make? It was ridiculous. The oil company also promised to increase the oil workers' salaries, build schools, hospitals, and roads, but those promises would also not be fulfilled on. To get back at the British, the Shah started doing business with the Germans during World War II. You know, the enemy of the British. So for the British, that was the last excuse they needed to get rid of the Shah for good. So in August 1941, the British and Soviets started a military assault to overthrow the Shah. On the outside, it was all about defeating the evil Germans and their allies. But deep down, it was all about securing all that precious oil bubbling below Iran's soil. 1 month later, they disposed of the Shah and put his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi on the throne.
Als der Vater nach seiner Abdankung Iran verlassen hat, blieb Mohammad Reza zurück. Also der Vater Reza Shah hat ihn auch zurückgelassen, hat eben auch gesagt, du musst das hier übernehmen, du bleibst hier.
But Muhammad wasn't anything like his father. He was more like a smooth-talking politician instead of a ruthless king. And at only 21 years old and born into power, he would have a hard time keeping a powerful nation like the British at bay. After World War II, the idea of nationalism swept through the developing world. And in Iran, that meant one thing. We've got to take back our oil from the evil British. The Iranian people were tired of handing over their precious oil to the British, more or less for free, while the Shah and the British continued to amass more and more wealth. Something had to change. And from the ashes rose one man that promised to take on both the British and the Shah, to give Iran back to its people. And that man went by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a man of integrity, an incorruptible politician who wanted to turn Iran into a wealthy, well-educated nation. And on April 28, 1951, Mossadegh became Iran's new prime minister with the full support of its people. He promised that from now on, oil profits would be used to develop Iran, not enrich Britain. And fortunately, he was one of the few leaders who actually followed through with his words. Only a few days later, he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which meant that he took the oil industry back from the British and put the Iranian government in charge of it. Iranians now finally had the chance to make a better living for themselves, and over the next few decades, it could even turn Iran into one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And the British? They were fuming. To them, taking their most lucrative business away from them was an act of war. So the British removed their technicians from Iran's oil fields, they blockaded the port, they cut off exports of vital goods to Iran, and they organized a full-blown boycott of Iranian oil. The Iranians were completely on their own. Without the know-how or connections to drill and sell their oil, they were back to square one. But their hatred for the British was so intense that they would never give up. Little did they know that the British government was only getting started. For the British, it was time to overthrow this Mossadegh guy. So the British turned to Washington with a simple request. Please overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh for us so we can have our oil back. But Harry Truman, the US president at that time, didn't see the point of a US intervention in Iran. The US didn't have any skin in this fight, so he rejected the request. For a moment, the British thought about invading Iran themselves. But then Dwight Eisenhower became the next US president in November 1952. He was a devoted anti-communist, and so was his Secretary of State John Dulles. So as soon as it was announced Eisenhower would be the next president, MI6, Britain's version of the CIA, sent an agent to America to discuss possibilities. The British told the Americans that nationalization and land reform sounded a lot like something called communism, that communists had infiltrated the Iranian government, that if the US doesn't act now, the entire Middle East could fall into communism. In 1953, the CIA got the green light for Operation Ajax. Their mission? Get Mossadegh out of the government, dead or alive. Less than a month later, Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah was back in power. And the British? By the end of 1953, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company resumes its usual operations. This time, it was renamed to something that might sound a little familiar. BP, or the British Petroleum Company. The Iran coup of 1953 was the first time the CIA had overthrown a democratic government. To the CIA, it was one of the most successful covert operations in their entire history. But little did they know that this one small act of aggression, this one decision to strip away the Iranian people's control over their country's own destiny, would be the first domino to fall in what would lead to some of the biggest terror attacks in the world. The Iranian coup of 1953 sowed the seeds of Middle Eastern terror.
So, overall, Winston Churchill bragged about the wealth of Iran and for the fact that Great Britain had achieved such a substantial amount of wealth from the land of fairy tales, essentially, for him. So, Iran has been exploited for a very long time, and I think it's very important that you cannot disregard that history. That's whether it's dealing with Mohammad Reza Shah or whether that's dealing with Mohammad Mossadegh. There's, very important figures that have played a part in Iran's history. And depending on who you talk to in Iran, or that is Iranian, they have a very different take on the history of events. Mohammad Mossadegh, for me, he cared so much about his people. That coup that took place in 1953, as people may or may not know, these files were declassified as of 2018, and it showed the CIA's involvement in Iran with overthrowing Mossadegh. And this began the beginning of the U.S. playing very strategic, covert operations involving the CIA, throwing coups.
So you're in the market to take over a country, to liberate its people, and to exploit its natural resources, steal its money, or just to earn the title of the world's newest dictator. There are a lot of benefits that come from launching a coup d'etat. And you're not alone. For decades, global superpowers like the US have gone crazy with coups and rigged elections to get the people they wanted in power. In the 42 years of the Cold War, from 1947 to 1989, America was involved in at least 70 attempts to overthrow governments. That is almost 2 a year. And the organization tasked with carrying out these operations? Our good friends at the CIA. They were so obsessed with overthrowing governments that they even released books like the Manual for Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare and the CIA Manual for Trickery and Deception. That way, their agents could learn the best way to get their unwanted leader out and the dictator of the day in. Sure, these coups often created worse leaders, but it was for the good of America, so it was worth it, right? Your first step as a soon-to-be world leader is to choose your country. Your best option is probably going to be your home country, or at least one you have citizenship in. You want to make your leadership look legitimate, so you have to be a man of the people to get popular supports. But that is not the only way to overthrow a government. None of the CIA's coups took place in the US for obvious reasons. They would go into another country, create instability, overthrow the government, and replace it with their own group of puppets. People that they could control without it looking like the US was in charge, and you can do the exact same thing. First, you want to choose a country with a weak political system, a lot of infighting, people protesting in the streets, or one without a lot of friendly neighbors. And you also want to make sure it's rich in natural resources like gold or oil, or the location has a strategic geopolitical advantage. You are in this for the money and power after all. And finally, make sure the country you choose has an easily corruptible military, because the military is going to be the one doing the dirty work of taking over the country for you. So a country where the military and government are often at odds is usually ripe for a coup. Most soldiers care more about their paycheck than where the money is coming from anyways, especially when the country doesn't have a strong national identity. As long as you maintain the salary status quo, they really won't care who they're working for. The CIA's most successful coups in countries like Iran, Guatemala, and Nicaragua all relied on getting the military to side with them early on. The goal is to come into the country as a knight in shining armor, claim that you're there to liberate the people from oppression, corruption, communism, whatever the word of the day is, and that's the angle you're gonna take next. Once you've picked the country, you're gonna need an inside man. This is gonna be the guy who drums up public and military support. Your propagandist. If you can find a high-level military officer who's also charming, or at least likable, and open to guidance on how to run a country, you have struck gold. Now you could also find two separate leaders, one to get support from the military, and another to be the face of the revolution, but for the sake of keeping things simple, try to find someone who can do both. And if you can't find the right guy right away, you can always replace the military officer later on. In the Iran coup, the CIA used General Zahedi and then blindsided him at the last minute by replacing him with the old Shah of Iran. In Guatemala, they used a colonel named Carlos Diaz. They promised him control of the country, and when the coup succeeded, they replaced him with another military leader, Castillo Armas. Not a great choice of mustache, but he was happy to cooperate with the US, so he was given control of the country. Who cares if the inside man you choose turns into a dictator? As long as he does what you say, you can always find a reason for bringing him into power. Now that you've found your puppet leader, your next step is to get popular support. Any successful coup will need the backing of the military, the right politicians, and big business. If you choose the right inside man, the military support will follow. Getting political support isn't much harder. All you have to do is play on the current president's bad decisions and suggest that someone new and more competent could run the country better. Most of the politicians will join you in hopes that their position and salaries get raised once the new government takes over. Arguably, the most important support you'll need is from the country's big businesses. They're the people who are going to be paying for a lot of your coup-related expenses. In Guatemala, the US government worked hand in hand with the US conglomerates that controlled the country. United Fruit. The US wanted a new government, and United Fruit wanted less business regulations. Once you've convinced the 3 biggest players to join your side, you're gonna need the international community to agree with your coup. And by international community, I mean America. Almost every successful coup has had some sort of US support or involvement. If your government takeover steps on America's toes, there's a good chance you'll end up like Afghanistan or Iraq. With decades of war to liberate your people and install an all-American puppet instead of the one you chose. So in order to get the world on your side, you'll have to promise America something. Oil rights, a dedicated tax haven, a shiny new base for a CIA black site. All of these are great ways to get your new government started on the right foot. Once you have America's support, the world will follow. All you have to do is throw around statements like, you're bringing the country into the modern age, or that you're encouraging international cooperation. Not only will this drum up political support for what you're about to do, but promising the right kind of favors could also get a lot of cash flowing into your coffers, ready to be used for your next steps. Up until now, your movements have been a secret. Every move has been calculated so that only your team members knows what's about to go down. Your next step will be the most risky. Psychological warfare, or getting the general population in the right mindset to support your coup. Once this step starts, there's a good chance the sitting government will smell a rat, so from now on you'll have to move very carefully to avoid drawing attention towards you and your team. The psychological warfare necessary to overthrow a government is all about creating chaos and fear. People need to yearn for stability, which you will hand them on a silver platter. Use your American friends in the media to propagate stories of how bad the current government is. Accuse the president of corruption, bribery, human rights abuses, whatever. Find incriminating evidence that top government officials had affairs, stole money, sold information to foreign countries, evaded taxes, anything to get the general public fired up with anger. Then start the violence. Encourage protests against the president to turn violent. Make it seem like the government is telling police to arrest and injure protesters. If the country is religious, get the religious leaders to speak out against the sitting president. Do anything it takes to make sure as many people as possible lose faith in the current government. This will make it seem like the coup happened because of corruption and incompetence, not the other way around. Once the public hates the government just enough, you're ready for the final step, raising an army. Most government takeovers are relatively peaceful, but that's only because the people throwing the coup have an army. So you're gonna need an army to intimidate any loyalists who might want to get in between you and the throne. This is where your inside man in the military and all that international support comes in handy. Getting army units on your side of the fight should be easy, and if you play your cards right, all those international governments you promised favors to will be offering you weapons and money to set your plan in motion. In some cases, like America's coup in Hawaii or Guatemala, the US government may even send in their own soldiers or equipment to help you take over as quickly as possible. Plan who will be doing what, when, and where. Make sure you have enough men and ammo to maintain control of key locations like government buildings, ports, military bases, and airstrips. Once you've got your army ready, your plan laid out, and the support of key political figures, it is time to launch your coup d'etat. Congratulations! You've made it to the moment we've all been waiting for. If you haven't been thrown in jail or killed by this point, your plan is actually likely to work. The tipping point for any government takeover is in the planning, so making it this far means that you're just one step away from sweet victory. The best days to stage a coup are always Thursday nights or Friday mornings. Once you've taken over the government, your main goal will be to return to business as usual as soon as possible. Staging a coup over the weekend means that people can stay home on Friday and then get back to their normal lives on Monday. Once you activate your team, their first objective should be to secure the highest point in government. This means taking over top-level government buildings and securing the president and his closest allies. While your teams are closing in on the president, other units should be securing all those strategic points we talked about earlier. A short internet blackout at this point could help your men work faster and block communication between the people who might oppose you. Cut off the capital city with military checkpoints and shows of power to prevent any opposition, and remind citizens that you are here to free them from their hated governments and that everything will go back to normal as long as they stay home and out of the streets. Most coups fail or succeed within the first few hours. If you manage to keep control of government buildings, military bases, and airstrips for more than 24 hours, you're well on your way to success. Now the last step is the regime change announcement. This is where your frontman goes out and reassures all the people that he has come to bring order and prosperity to all citizens, and that everything will be so much better with him in charge than before. Hold on to power for another 24 hours, and by the time Monday comes around, you'll be ready to establish your brand new government. The first week after a coup is probably more important than anything leading up to it. This is where you appoint your new political leaders, choose a new president, and destroy anyone who might oppose you. Once you've created a government that suits your ambitions, it's time to do a little nation building. Set up a few new schools, construct some roads, kiss a few babies, and rebrand yourself and the puppet president as men of the people. Once you firmly establish your rule, you're ready to suck the nation dry for all it's got.
Whether that was in South America over multiple countries, in Iran, whether that was dealing with the Vietnam War and what took place in Vietnam, how in Vietnam there was a war that was going on that unfortunately helped assist in the invasion of Cambodia based on the US's involvement in Vietnam and what that translated out to be. And also with the CIA going into Afghanistan at the time in 1979, where they trained the Mujahideen and they supplied arms to them.
The US State Department cables, 1978 was a very interesting period. These cables have come through the State Department system into National Archives, and we have sucked them all out and put them into our system, where we now have more than 2 million cables in the collection, all indexed. So 1978, very interesting time period. We have deliberately released all 400,000 at once to everyone. So no one's had an opportunity to cherry pick, and we haven't done that either. What we have done is identified broad areas which are very interesting. For example, 1978 actually set in progress many of the regional elements, the geopolitical elements that are playing out today. For example, 1978 was the beginning of the Iranian Revolution. It wasn't until 1979 that it succeeded, but the push against the Shah started in 1978 with demonstrations and killings in response. Similarly, Nicaragua. In 1978, the Sandinista movement started in its popular form as a result of a killing of a newspaper editor, and was complete within 2 years. Afghanistan. The war period in Afghanistan began in 1978 and hasn't stopped since. It was the Soviet-friendly government came in 1978, the assassination of the previous president, the arrival of Soviet special forces towards the end of the year. 1978 saw the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. And while you might think, oh, well, that just concerns Vietnam and Cambodia, no, this is an important consequence of the Vietnam War and how Cambodia was used and became a Chinese and American proxy in relation to Vietnam. So China, the UK, US, supported Cambodia against the Vietnamese. the Vietnamese prevailed. But the conflict also led to a finalization of what had started under Kissinger's rapprochement with China, a decisive move to configure China against the Soviet Union and onto the US side of the Cold War conflict. And this war with Vietnam is something that facilitated Brzezinski's visit to China and the eventual normalization of relations, which occurred shortly after.
When it comes to Afghanistan, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in an interview with a French newspaper, talked about the arming of the Mujahideen, of Osama bin Laden and others, saying, what's a few riled up Muslims?
It was Brzezinski's, the moment of history that Brzezinski is the proudest of, is in fact Afghanistan. And creating a Vietnam for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan by arming the Mujahideen and bin Laden.
So that the Soviets would have their own quagmire.
So the Soviets would have their own quagmire, which they did. And that started 1978.
Through Henry Kissinger, and pretty much enabled the modern-day Taliban to become who they ended up becoming in order to fight a proxy war with Russia at the time, to keep Russia busy in a proxy war. Unfortunately, a lot of people see that that might be a similar situation that is taking place with Russia and Ukraine at the current moment. But getting back onto Iran had multiple regime changes from 53 to the last Shah of Iran that took over after Mossadegh got put out of his position. And I think this plays a very pivotal, important part to know about. Iran has very strong roots, and not only initially through Zoroastrianism, but also through Islamic influence. Iran didn't actually become an Islamic country officially until 1502, and that was through the Safavid dynasty. And Safavid, from then onward, they continued on as a Shiite country. But prior to 1502, Iran had multiple forms of religion before that became a nationalized religion officially for Iran. And I think that's a very pivotal thing to point out, because it's hard to ignore that Iran did have an Islamic influence for a very long time. So that's something to bear in mind for the Iranian people, to try to factor in, sort of to rationalize whether Iran is okay as an Islamic country, or whether that's a good or a bad thing. That there is a history that it's been present in the country for over 500 years, and it hasn't initially affected the country in a very negative way. I think the biggest struggle as of late, as of modern times, from the Persian Empire to the 21st century, which during the 21st century people tend to refer to Iran as Iran, just rather not Persia, but Iran as of the 20th century. It's just the fact that Iran has been exploited for a very long time, and that's from BP, the Anglo-Persian War that was taking place before British Petroleum took over with the name change. But the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, before it became BP, Iran has been facing exploitation for a very long time. And every time Iran tried to independence itself and nationalize its oil, it became a problem for the US and for Great Britain and their sovereignty of them having a foothold and imprint in the Middle East and in your country. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, at some point, if you ask for outside help, you are going to be at the detriment of whoever you're asking for help from an oppressor. You will be oppressed. And that has taken place also in my home country, within Africa, with the US, with Britain, with France, and their foothold in Africa, and how they've exploited that, and they refuse to leave and allow these countries to operate underneath their own sovereignty without there being some sort of influence taking place. That can go up to the latest, what happened with Libya involving Gaddafi, and Gaddafi wanting to use African currency, use his own dinar, and instead of being underneath the American petrodollar, he wanted to do gold-backed standard for Africa. And it was one of the only opportunities Africa potentially could have found themselves being able to rise up underneath its own economic independence and be able to develop itself.
In October 2000, the president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, announced they would no longer be selling oil in US dollars, only in euros. Which on the surface is an innocent change. What's the big deal? The big deal is that Iraq has the 5th largest petroleum reserves in the world, and in the 2000s it had become the world's 5th largest oil producer. So when Hussein decided to start selling oil in euros instead of dollars, the US wasn't too happy. By February 2003, he has sold over 3 billion barrels of oil for 26 billion euros. A month later, the US invaded Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
In an operation ironically called Operation Iraqi Freedom. They overthrew Saddam, and by June, just 4 months later, the country was back to selling oil in dollars. Years later, a number of US officials started to let the truth seep out. Former head of US operations in Iraq, General John Abizaid, said, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan wrote in his memoir that, quote, "I'm saddened that it's politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil," end quote. And former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said the same in 2007. Quote, "People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are," end quote. Venezuela, 2002. Coincidentally, Venezuela also has large oil reserves. In fact, they have the largest proven oil reserves in the world. At the time, Hugo Chavez was in charge of Venezuela as the dictator president. But Chavez, a die-hard anti-American leader, was about to make the same grave mistake that Saddam Hussein made. He planned to start selling oil for euros instead of the mighty American dollar. Well, we can't have that now, can we? So in 2002, the US backed a coup against Chavez, which ultimately failed, but it crippled the country and its economy. Empires are built on oil. Yet despite having the largest oil reserves in the world, today Venezuela is one of the poorest economies in the world. Do other factors play into that? Many. We talked about a few of them on this channel before. But going against the US is probably a big no-no. Libya, 2009. Eerily similar to Venezuela and Iraq, Libya has the largest oil reserves in Africa, and they weren't doing that bad. They did a great job managing all those oil revenues, building up a 143-ton gold reserve according to WikiLeaks. They had the highest GDP per capita in Africa, and Libya was on track to become the most influential country in Africa. And also similar to Venezuela and Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, suggested all Muslim and African countries buy oil from Libya using a new currency backed by their giant gold reserves instead of US dollars. In other words, they wanted to sell oil in exchange for gold instead of US dollars, and other major African governments were ready to support. But I think we can all guess what happened next. NATO led a military coalition into Libya in the name of freedom, of course, and on August 20th, 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was executed by Libyan militias, backed by US drone strikes. Years later, it was discovered in Hillary Clinton's emails that NATO really wanted to overthrow Gaddafi's government, mainly because of this plan for an African gold-backed currency, supported by Libya's oil reserves. This was Libya before, and this is Libya today. A failed state with widespread poverty and an ongoing civil war. Why? Because each of these countries tried to break away from using the dollar as payment for their oil, and each of them faced the consequences of America's wrath. Out of all of them, none were able to recover from America's interventions in the name of freedom and in taking down an axis of evil.
And their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, servants of evil, the cult of evil, a monumental struggle of good versus evil.
And they usually ended up far worse than they were before. all these countries had problems, but all of these countries had huge economic potential despite their dictator leaders. But as soon as they moved away from selling oil in dollars, the US swooped in and quickly put an end to the party. And they're not alone. Which begs the question, why is it so important for oil to be only sold in US dollars? What's the big deal? Why is America so quick to liberate people as soon as this oil for dollars arrangement is threatened? This is the petrodollar, how your money is inexorably linked to oil and war. 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and soon after, the US chose a radically different economic path filled with, you guessed it, expensive social programs and expensive wars. President Johnson's Great Society social programs along with Cold War spending and the invasion of Vietnam caused US debt to skyrocket. See, unlike World War II or the Korean War, the Vietnam War was the first American war waged almost entirely on debt. It was a period of guns and butter. Guns as in wars, butter as in social programs. The one nation the world trusted to uphold the entire financial system was drowning in debt. Just $11 billion in gold backed $24 billion in US dollars. And other nations were starting to get nervous. The French and the British soon came knocking, with France even sending a warship to New York demanding their gold back. Backed into a corner, the US thought, well, I need more money to fund more wars and social programs. I can't print more money because of the rules of the Bretton Woods system we all agreed on, and countries I'm holding gold for are knocking. Even though I'm drowning in debt, I still am at the center of the world. I still have the most influence and power. On paper, the world is supposed to hold me accountable. But in reality, whatever I do, the world has to follow whether they like it or not. So instead of following the rules set forth at Bretton Woods, why not just rewrite them one more time? So a few days after France sends the battleship to New York demanding their gold back, Nixon shocked the world with this message.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Actually, the French sent like a battleship to New York City in August of 71 to like redeem their gold, and the British asked for like about 3 billion pounds of gold. Nixon, in a famous speech, actually went on TV and he declared, this was a few days after we're ending the gold window, you know, other nations can no longer redeem their dollars for gold, as the US was entering into like a very inflationary decade.
Basically, in 1971, Nixon changed the very foundation of the entire global financial system in a total of 16 seconds by giving the middle finger to countries wanting their gold back as a temporary measure. But as we should all be well acquainted with by now, few things are as permanent as temporary measures. This would mark the end of the Bretton Woods system. The world went into a financial crisis, the Nixon shock had devastating effects on foreign economies, and America's response to this crisis? Well, in the words of Nixon himself, I don't give a shit about the lira. For the first time in modern history, the world transitioned from the gold standard to a global reserve currency not backed by anything at all, just the blind faith that the US dollar was worth something. Fiat money. And this all happened at the snap of the US's finger. The US came out on top once more, but then just a few years later, another existential crisis hit the US. Oil.
So first of all, you have this change between like colonial powers kind of controlling oil to sovereign dictatorships controlling oil.
In 1973, the US was supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, also known as the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. So as a collective middle finger to the US, OPEC, the cartel of Arabic petroleum exporters, announced an embargo on oil sales to the US and the quadrupling of global oil prices.
The Arabs made an economic power play. As punishment for this country's support of Israel, 11 Arab countries cut off all oil shipments to the United States.
We are heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II.
Why was this so devastating? Because even in the 70s, oil dominated every aspect of America's daily lives. It fueled our cars, it was needed to produce plastic. It provided electricity for our homes and factories. It was even in the fertilizer needed to grow food. So if you cut off America's oil supply, cargo ships stop, delivery trucks stop, people can't drive to work. You can literally collapse the American empire simply by taking away its oil. And that's what OPEC was threatening. And through this oil crisis, these Arab nations got filthy rich.
So you had oil kind of going from like $2 a barrel, where it was for like a long time, to $10, $11, $12 a barrel. Now, this created an enormous flow of cash for the Saudis and the OPEC nations. This was a historic moment because it was so much money. Essentially, the OPEC ran a surplus and the rest of the world ran a net deficit. I mean, I can't stress how much, just how much money came into the coffers of these Arab regimes. And by the end of that year, 73, the dollar had actually lost 20% of its value against other top currencies. And people called this like a peacetime redistribution of global wealth on a scale that had never been seen in living memory.
That's why when OPEC exposed this giant weakness in America by restricting their oil supply, the US had to make sure something like this would never happen again. They had to make sure that somehow the US dollar still came out on top, so they could keep all this giant spending going on wars and social programs. The oil regimes had more money than they knew what to do with, and the US needed a way to fund its spending. Enter the petrodollar. In 1974, the US sent William Simon, the new Treasury Secretary, to strike a deal with Saudi Arabia. His main objective was to get the kingdom to sell oil in only US dollars. In exchange, America would provide the kingdom with military aid, protection, and equipment. In short, Saudi would have a ton of dollars lying around because everyone who wanted oil from them would have to pay for it in dollars. They could then buy US treasuries with those dollars and finance America's spending. That way, they would at least get a return on those dollars, along with protection from the US, instead of letting that money just sit there. And since the world ran on oil, making oil buyable only in dollars was a great way to make sure everyone kept using the dollar, thus making it remain the reserve currency of the world. And the best part yet, whenever America needs more oil to fuel for the American empire, they could just print more money. Because oil was only sold in dollars, and the US controlled the money printer for this fiat currency that was no longer pegged to gold.
And this really helped us, of course, in the Soviet the struggle with the Soviets, because through this system we could print, we could print money to buy oil. Soviets had to literally dig it out of the ground or somehow get dollars in another way. And this gave us a huge, huge advantage. But essentially, Simon and Kissinger said, hey, and this is a quote from Simon, if the OPEC nations put a larger amount of their accumulated funds into investment in this country, this was a way of saving the day. Because the other way to save the day would be if the American public spent less and saved more. And that was not going to happen with Nixon, facing impeachment. So the idea is they were like, we need to get other nations to finance our debt because we're not going to do it through raising taxes. There's no way. So, essentially the deal was in the petrodollar system that these dollars that these OPEC nations were earning, that they would not only force the sale of oil to be in dollars. So all oil sales were now denominated in dollars, but they would take the earnings and they would actually buy US debt with the profits. And this is what we call petrodollar recycling. And this mechanism really saved dollar hegemony, I think, would be my thesis.
Both sides won in this arrangement. So in June 1974, Kissinger and Crown Prince Fuad signed the agreements, and thus the US dollar was inextricably married to oil, and the petrodollar was born. It was a match made in hell that outlasted almost every American partnership that came after it.
It wasn't necessarily a market decision, would be the other thing I would just try to kind of hammer home. This was all ironed out through secret deals. The Saudis could have just kind of pursued a broader portfolio of investment. They didn't have to go so heavy on US debt. They didn't have to price oil in dollars. These were decisions they made in exchange for protection. Okay, in exchange for massive amounts of weapons, massive amounts of protection. So essentially the Saudis became, non-market investors in US debt, and the US became a non-market seller of weapons to the Saudis.
With Saudi Arabia holding a lot of influence in the Middle East, it didn't take long for other OPEC nations to follow their lead. If you want to buy oil from them, you'd have to do it in dollars. And by 1975, just 1 year later, Saudi imports of US military equipment stood at more than $5 billion. Since everyone had to exchange their currencies for dollars to buy oil, demand for dollars skyrocketed and so did the value of the dollar. And the stronger the dollar compared to other currencies, the cheaper it got to import goods, the cheaper it was to invest abroad, and the cheaper it was to start businesses outside the US, to take over emerging economies and to extend the US's influence even further. Or in other words, the US dollar and the US empire continued to reign supreme. And it built an almost unbreakable alliance between the US and Saudi Arabia that still lasts to today. It also meant that every time a nation threatened the rule of the petrodollar, the US would go to the ends of the earth defending it, under the guise of freedom and liberation, of course. August 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait and takes control of the country's oil fields. The Iraqi military occupies the country for 7 months, and since Kuwait was a major oil supplier to the US, surprise surprise, they quickly got involved, liberated Kuwait from the oppression of Iraq, and got oil production moving again as soon as possible. This would be known as the First Gulf War. During their retreat, Iraqi troops set fire to 600 Kuwaiti oil wells, leading to some horrifying and spectacular footage. And then you have all the other examples we went over at the beginning of this video, with Saddam Hussein announcing in 2000 that he would no longer sell oil in dollars, only euros, which led to Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, with Hugo Chavez announcing the same thing in 2002, they'll only sell oil in euros instead of dollars, which led to a US-backed coup, with Gaddafi of Libya in 2009 trying to sell oil in gold, leading to his US-backed execution, and many other examples we don't have time to cover. In all these cases, the US claimed that they were going after brutal, unethical dictators in order to free the people. Operation Iraqi Freedom. But the US doesn't really care about dictators, only the ones that threaten US supremacy. In fact, working and partnering with dictatorships is a norm in US geopolitical history, as long as it benefits America. And the best example of this is Saudi Arabia. The country is accused of horrific human rights violations, pretty much non-existent women's rights, and the murder of journalists. But you'll never hear a Bush or Obama or Trump or Biden say a single bad thing about Saudi Arabia. Although it seems like the petrodollar is all-powerful, that may not be the case forever.
And for me personally, so I see that and I'm offended by what took place with my people and what's been going on with my people since the transatlantic slave trade. So with Iran actually has some connections to Africa that some people aren't quite familiar with. So in the 10th century, Shirazi people fled from Shiraz down to Safar, if I'm not mistaken. That's on the coastline of Iran. And they fled for what was rumored to be one of two reasons. The biggest aspect of the fleeing of Shiraz was that they felt that the leader of Iran, of Shiraz, Ali Shirazi, at the time, he felt like Iran might be facing some sort of persecution from an outside force to come and invade Shiraz specifically, and that he was going to lose his dynasty. So he spoke to the people, and himself and a lot of people fled to the coastline and sought refuge elsewhere. So these Persians had set sail and ended up in Tanzania, in Africa, in Zanzibar specifically. And so Persians fled and they settled in not only Tanzania, but in Kenya. So there's a very beautiful history that Kenya and Tanzania, specifically all throughout Zanzibar, they have a huge Iranian influence. There's a particular documentary that'd be really good for you guys to check out if you get the chance. It's called Persians of Zanzibar. And we'll include an excerpt of that here, if you can just enjoy.
To see the land to which our ancestors migrated, we need to travel to the port of Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, to follow the path through which the first group of Shirazis passed.
There was about 14 people who arrived first, and they built the houses, about 100 of them.
The people who came, they were Iranians. That is very clear, because it says that they are from Shiraz, led by Ali bin Hassan.
The Iranians have left numerous traces in Zanzibar, and Shirazi's traces can be found all over Zanzibar.
در واقع شیرازی ها وقتی که در سواحل و جزایر شرق آفریقا شامل کنیا، تانزانیا و مجموع جزایر کمور مستقر شدن، یادگارهای خودشون برجا گذاشتن که یکی از مهمترین اونها جشن نوروز.
Yeah, so that is something very beautiful. And so I've always been curious about Iran because in the south of Iran, they have a huge Afro-Iranian community, also with the Bindari people. And there's connections with Afro-Iranians. There's also connections also with Afghanistan in different ways.
Tamamen dış görünüş olarak Afrikalılar. Ola Betuni. Balıklara bakın. Şu an ağdan çıkartıyorlar. Aha, به خاطر اون حلوا میگن.
But there is an Afro-Iranian influence, and I feel like that's sort of painted over because there's a huge inclusion of wanting to feel almost westernized and Europeanized, and to a certain degree, because that's in modern day times, that's viewed as, I guess, a sense of prestige to a certain degree. I guess the more fairer skin you are, the more European features you are, that's supposed to mean that you're of more prominence. There's people that have conversations about Iranians that have green eyes or blue eyes, and I hear these conversations and people mention it to me casually. I'm like, that's cool, but it's almost is spoken about as though that's like a superiority thing, and I just view that as sort of a byproduct of Iran geographically, where they're located. You know, geopolitically, they have a lot of influence, like I spoke about earlier, with the multiple dynasties that taken place, and also with Russians that are across, you know, the water in parts of Iran that also came down into Iran and mated with locals that were there. So world history is fascinating. We're all connected in some sort of degree. So some people may not feel I have a valid voice to even speak on the subject, but I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart because I see how deeply people are affected by these things. Now, with the death of Mahsa Amini and what has taken place with not only that, but multiple deaths that have taken place at protests and human rights campaigns that have happened all throughout the years, and that can go back to the Green Movement or what they call the Arab Spring. These things played a very pivotal part, and unfortunately, the United States at the time of the Arab Spring began to understand about the power, the influence of Twitter, specifically, how it can be weaponized as a usage for social movements or social engineering. And so recently, the CIA unfortunately had some documents that got leaked. And this was done through a study from MIT, if I'm not mistaken. But MIT had released information that showed and proved the US and the Pentagon ran very specific social media campaigns to influence Iran in a way of information warfare through propaganda.
Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei accused the United States, though, and Israel of stoking these protests. Here is what he said on Monday. He said, "I explicitly say that these riots and this insecurity were designed by the U.S. and the occupying fake Zionist regime and those who are paid by them." Now, maybe that's true, but this is clearly not why protesters came. People are coming out in the street to protest Islamic law that dictates what a woman can wear, right? But the U.S. has been caught stirring unrest in Iran in recent weeks. So, of course, if you say that this is a protest stoked by Western powers, people accuse you of minimizing the movement. I don't want to do that. I want to acknowledge that both things can be true.
Right.
Right? It can be exploited by the West, and it can also be a legitimate movement, a movement of legitimate intent, albeit a dangerous one. That's
Right.
why it does matter who stokes it.
It's the exact same thing that happened during the Arab Spring, right? Of course, this was part of it, right? It says there was among young people in Iran that there was this discontent, but at the same time, Western money and Western intelligence operatives absolutely using this as an opportunity to stoke violence and to create unrest in this country.
Right. It matters because the West talks a good game about not interfering in other republics. It matters because the West is provoking people, if that part is true, into a cause that will bring about their own death.
Right.
Right? It matters because these are dangerous protests. And I had to sit here and I wondered, would I bring my daughters to this? Would I allow my daughters to then remove their hijab knowing how dangerous it is for them? Would I go, for them? Like, these are uncomfortable questions that I don't have to subject to my daughters. But this is why this is such an important thing. There's this viewpoint, though, of social change. Will this then bring about social change? Will it help shift the rules that these women live by? Maybe. In fact, you're seeing all kinds of inspiring images such as this, women removing their hijabs in protest and singing. But you will notice that they are careful not to show their faces because it's so dangerous for them. So what you're hearing here is these women singing. These are college students and high school students, and they're singing a song that was written for this movement. Now, the Ayatollah has backed his security forces in their efforts to contain the protests, which means that this could and will get increasingly deadly. For both sides, Iranian security forces are saying that they have reported deaths too. But of course, so have the protesters. The exact numbers are really hard to pin down because this is a continuing story. This protest is being stoked by local universities, and they say they are not going to stop until the laws change for them. And women are sort of acting as if the laws have changed and getting arrested now for having breakfast without their hijab and other violations of what is currently Islamic law. So I think it's worth asking, why then would the Ayatollah accuse the US and Israel of instigating? Well, Israel is Iran's biggest enemy and the US best friend. So what is bad for Iran is good for those two, right?
Of course.
Now, President Biden released his own statement on Monday. I'm going to show it to you. It's interesting because he's saying we gravely have concerns about this. We don't like it. This is not right. Iran's regime has denied fundamental freedoms. All the words, right? The word salad, freedoms, not right. All of that, violence, coercion. It's interesting, though, what they say they're going to do about it. So I want you to just remember this. The United States is making it easier for Iranians to access the internet, including through facilitating greater access to secure outside platforms and services. Okay, let's talk about what the United States is doing with the internet to Iran. Okay? Because in recent weeks, just about a week and a half ago, the Washington Post published this article about a report that accuses the U.S. of promoting misinformation abroad through the Pentagon in Iran. It says that social media companies, specifically Facebook and Twitter, have identified fake accounts that were literally run by the U.S. military. Facebook and Twitter both removed the accounts in violation of their own rules. So all of this, the Pentagon wants to help counter misinformation BS.
Right.
As we suspected, it's exactly the opposite. The Pentagon is guilty of perpetuating information warfare. These were bots and troll accounts managed by CENTCOM, or Central Command, which manages all U.S. military actions in West Asia, North Africa, South and Central Asia. The information from the report came from a company called Graphica and Stanford Internet Observatory. These organizations were contracted by Facebook and Twitter after both companies found all of these overlapping sets of accounts and removed them, and then referred this to a research firm to verify that this was in fact government-led. And it turns out that it is. In fact, the Pentagon has actually acknowledged that they do this, and their official position is, yeah, we're going to look into it. Colin Kahl, who is the Undersecretary of Defense, says that he's calling for a full accounting of these operations by next month. So helpful. Thanks.
But of course we know they're doing this, right? This is, and the fact that the Washington Post called this out is kind of a rare moment for Western media.
Yes, but it got shockingly low amount of coverage for what it is, right? And I'm going to show you more about because this is crazy behavior.
Well, I think about the sliding scale we have, right? When Edward Snowden breaks the story, we get this information from The Guardian, and Glenn Greenwald reports on Edward Snowden and the NSA whistleblowing story, and we find out that the NSA is tapping phones and spying on Americans. Then, shortly before the war breaks out in Ukraine, we learn that the CIA has been actively spying on Americans.
Yeah.
Right? Where did that story go? It just disappeared into the ether. Now we have a story like this that's like it's almost no coverage. But this is what American taxpayers are funding this operation?
That, let me create a new Twitter account and start some shit somewhere in the world.
Right.
Right? Okay. So here's what they found specifically about Iran, which is a main target of this CENTCOM mission. It says that this section discusses the 21 Twitter accounts, 2 Facebook pages, 5 Facebook profiles, 6 Instagram accounts that formed the covert campaign focused on Iranian audiences. These assets had names in Persian, and those that posted content mainly did so in Persian about Iran. The Twitter accounts posted primarily between November 2020 through March 2022, and the Facebook pages and Instagram accounts posted primarily through June of 2022. There were no visible posts for the Facebook profile. So that is a lot of work, right? That they are deciding to just like create these accounts and stir the pot. Well, here is one such post from the government's own. This is from the United States government, right? Put this post up.
From their own fake account.
Yes. And it is specifically, it says that social media is the only way. So what they're saying is that the internet is the only way Iranians can access the free world, and it is the main enemy of the Iranian regime, right? Therefore, the regime uses all of its efforts to censor and filter the internet. So, you better be happy you have the internet. It is your only path to freedom. Didn't we just see President Biden saying we'd like to make sure you've got more internet? We need to make sure the Iranians have more internet. And we're doing this with it, right? In the meantime, these accounts also rang in on women's rights regarding Islamic dress, right? It says from the report that they focused on women's rights through most prominently on Facebook and Instagram, and they compared Iranian women's opportunities abroad with those in Iran, and they noted that little has changed for women in Iran over time, specifically as it relates to the hijab. Here are 2 examples of that. This one right here, it compares the experience of Iranian women abroad, such as working as astronauts, with Iranian women in Iran seemingly beaten, right? Mm-hmm. Here's another one. It shows that Iranian women, before the Islamic Revolution, were sort of dressed in Western garb, and now they are forced to wear this, right? Okay, this may be legitimate points, but it's the U.S. government posting these things, right?
Posting propaganda.
Anonymously or not anonymously, like undercover through false pretenses.
Right.
The report says that Iran has been the major target for these ops. They say they centered in 3 nations and regions: Iran, Afghanistan, and Arabic-speaking Middle East groups comprising Iraqi and Saudi subgroups, some of which contain a few accounts associated with Syria, Kuwait, and Yemen. We will link you to the report below, because it is just such bizarre behavior, and it is exactly the thing that the U.S. has been screaming that Russia does.
Right. Yeah, this is the thing, of course, they tell us that Russia is doing, planting bot accounts, affecting our elections by putting in disinformation campaigns. And then the United States government under the Department of Homeland Security is setting up a disinformation campaign organization led by the Department of Homeland Security that's going to be making sure that you're not being lied to on the internet with fake accounts and fake Twitter handles and fake Facebook posts and propaganda. We're going to try to protect Americans from this type of content, and yet we are creating it.
Meanwhile,
actively.
CENTCOM is like, that's a good idea. I guess we should be doing that. And they are doing that. So doesn't it feel strange to consider that the government has admitted to running fake social media accounts about women's rights in Iran at just days before a legitimate unrest breaks out, right? So to bring this back to the current protests, of course the Ayatollah has reason to suspect that the U.S. has instigated trouble. They have been doing that. But the protesters, again, have their own reasons legitimately to protest too. Who would want to live in fear of wearing the wrong thing, right? So this is a tricky question. Is the West helping or hurting, right? Because the West doesn't have a good track record of helping
when is the West
when it comes to this, right? And so the question then is, should we just leave it to Iran to work this out on their own? That's an uncomfortable question, right?
Yeah, should we let a sovereign country work through their own growth on their own, with their own customs and culture?
So a legitimate answer would be, well, obviously they haven't, right? These women have to dress like this, so maybe they do need some outside help, right? But do they need this kind of outside help, which is illegitimizing a country for alternative motives, right? And so again, I want to acknowledge that this is a tough one, but we cannot ignore what is happening legitimately and what is the context that is legitimately happening within.
Well, I mean, also you have to understand the United States and Israel want the total destruction of Iran. I mean, that's without a doubt. We see proxy wars being set up in Azerbaijan, right? We see funneling of weapons to fight and to try to foment discontent there against Iranians that are in Turkey. So again, this is continuous, it's unending, and all you need to do is look at where the money flows and what sort of operations are being carried out. Look at Stuxnet, for instance, right? The United States, working with Israel, launches Stuxnet, launches one of the worst cyber attacks in world history, right? Shut down their nuclear power plants, shut down the enrichment of uranium, shut down their reactor cores, shut down their entire computer systems,
right?
As they were trying to enrich uranium. And it was pinpointed right back to Stuxnet, right back to Washington.
Right.
And of course, Obama had to apologize for it.
So the Western influence undeniably has malintent for this region, right? Which is why I don't feel like a statement from President Biden on this violent crackdown, it rings hollow. I do feel like it rings hollow. But that absolutely still means that you can hope for this region freedom for women to wear what they want with impunity. So both things can be true.
So they were creating social media accounts that were essentially praising Iranian women for their freedom in the West, for them being able to have their hair free, and for them to be able to freely live their lives at the disadvantage of what they were trying to show, that they wanted to show Iranian women in Iran what they were missing out on. So there was these social media accounts that were being created to kind of polarize the differences from women in Iran to the women that were outside of Iran, whether they were in the United States or in Australia or Canada, some Western country, but to make the women in Iran feel like they were missing out from this influence of being able to, quote unquote, have freedoms. So I don't, I think people need to understand that what's taking place, everything isn't as what it seems. Even the story down to Mahsa Amini, where they explained that she was beaten in the police station, and it was due to the fact that she had a hijab on, allegedly, and the hijab was the alleged reason that allegedly she was beaten, and she had fell unconscious and they hauled her off. Now, Iranian officials had released video footage of showing Mahsa Amini in the police station. From what was being told, it was due to the fact that she had on pants that were too tight, and then she was of Kurdistan descent, and she came into Tehran, if I'm not mistaken, underneath not understanding the local law, and her brother and her had asked for some special exceptions, and they just wanted to take her in and talk to her about her presentation. And she fell out within the police station, passed out. On video, they hauled her out into an ambulance, and she fell into a coma and she had passed away. Now, the video that got mass marketed was saying that she like I said, she had died of initially being beaten by police. But, based on that CCTV footage, that seems not to be what had taken place.
And like most things, the media wants you to reduce this story to a simple narrative. And we here want to parse out the nuance, because it's impossible to not talk about what is happening and the context in which it is happening. Both things must be discussed together, and we are going to do this. Now, the media says a woman was killed by Iranian police. They are evil. Women are standing up to this regime. This is the real heroic story. A lot of that is true, right? But it necessitates context. So let's back up and talk about what's happening. The protests revolve around Islamic rules, particularly for women. They began after a 22-year-old woman named Mahsa Amini died in police custody after she was arrested for wearing improper clothing. Originally, the media was reporting that it had to do with the hijab, but most recent reports are that it was because her pants were too tight. She was in Tehran with her family on a visit, but she is not from that city, so she was less familiar with the rules when police took her into custody. Even though she and her brother asked for leniency when they were stopped by police, they said, "We're not from here. We didn't know, please don't take her in." But they took her in anyway. Now, reports began circulating that she was beaten to her death while she was in custody, and she died after going into a coma a few days later. And that is what sparked these protests in the days after her funeral. But then the Iranian government released this video showing the moment that she collapsed. So we are going to show it to you. I will talk over it because it has, it's in Farsi, and I'm going to assume you don't speak that. So let's go ahead and play it. So you see her walking
همونطور که می‌بینید خانم مهسا امینی هستن که وارد
I'm sorry about that. You see her walking into the station and then looking where to sit, and she sits for a while. Now, again, the reporting that she had been beaten previously to this is interesting because her body language doesn't necessarily show distress. She certainly does seem exasperated by the ordeal. She doesn't exactly know, is someone going to call me up? What's going to happen? And she comes to talk to this person. And when you watch, she gestures to her pants. So she's saying, like, look, the pants are, is this really a problem? What's going on here? The woman just sort of brushes her off, and then you will see her collapse in just a minute. So now the narrative that, well, she collapsed because she had been beaten before that doesn't necessarily seem consistent with her body language, right? So now after this collapse, she did go into a coma. She did die days later. Now, thousands have taken to the streets in Iran, as well as around the world, to protest Islamic rules. Here is a protest this weekend. This was posted by an Israeli actress. And so this is obviously a protest that has meaning to people because she had, in many's mind, she had no business being swooped up by police for just wearing those pants, right? And then there is this narrative of whether or not she was mistreated while she was in custody, which the Iranian government refutes.
Now, I want to tell you, the news is free because they need to control you. And that doesn't matter whether that comes from your home country or whether that comes from an outside entity. Now, what African Americans had to learn with the George Floyd situation, unfortunately, is that when something is mass marketed, it's done intentionally. They took footage of George Floyd, mass marketed it throughout the world, and also for the African American community to unfortunately be put into a state of outrage. There's killings all the time in the United States on a massive scale, but they took this one killing and decided to mass market it, and it became a global campaign of outrage. And I've seen my people be played year by year underneath the term Black to keep my people longing to belong and in a state of constant perpetual outrage with no real change.
3 reasons why Black Lives Matter is a scam. Out of the $90 million BLM received as donations in 2020, $60 million simply vanished. BLM co-founder purchased properties worth over $3 million. When the news became public, she resigned. BLM paid out $26 million to Patricia Cullors' relatives and close associates.
This narrative, which we were all lied to about, inflated an organization that purported to be about Black Lives Mattering. I went into the finances.
Yeah, what did you find?
What I found was that millions and millions of dollars are going to trans organizations.
What kind of organizations?
Quite literally trans organizations. Like, we focus on providing trans houses. One was, we are focused on building the first ever fully transgender district in San Francisco. We are focused on, they're all buying houses and building districts, I'll say that, it's a lot of real estate. We are focused on providing a oasis for transgendered people in Ohio, right? House of Gigi, House of Tulip, a transgender district. We are focused on sex workers, all sex workers. How does any of this go to furthering Black lives, right? We found that $30+ million went to the stock market. I thought this was about tearing down the institutions of white supremacy.
At that time when the BLM founder Patrisse Cullors said that IRS audits were racist, now we know why she thinks that.
Yeah.
According to the Daily Mail, quote, newly released tax filings revealed how Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors used charity funds to pay her friends and family,
she's the worst,
large sums for various consulting services. The documents reveal BLM paid a company owned by Damon Turner, the father of Cullors' child, nearly $970,000 to help produce live events and provide other creative services, or should we say, pro-creative services. Enjoyable stuff, creative services. The co-founder's brother, Paul Cullors, received more than $840,000 for providing security services to the foundation. When she was like, I'm hiring security, what she actually meant is my brother is coming over to play video games. Leaders have attempted to justify the expense by saying the foundation's protection could not be entrusted to former police professionals because the BLM movement is known for protesting law enforcement. Yeah, that's right. They couldn't hire any former cops for security because cops are bad, so instead, I hired my brother for almost $1 million.
I actually did not know what 990s were before all of this happened. The accountant handled that. Like, I don't know what that is. It is such a trip now to hear the word, the term 990s. I'm like, ugh, it's like triggering. This doesn't seem safe for us. This 990 structure, this nonprofit system structure, this is like deeply unsafe. Like, this is being literally weaponized against us.
How is a form unsafe? And then
because it reveals where the money's going.
Yeah. But I mean, this is partially our fault for continuing to overuse the word weaponized, because now it's like just a form can be weaponized. BLM used to stand for Black Lives Matter. Now it stands for Buy Lovely Mansions.
Oh, that's really good.
Not bad. Thank you, Judge.
Here's the problem with that. Every year, all of us file tax returns. Every year, all of us know that we've got to report income, and there are certain forms that we have to fill. And then these people, she is triggered by the IRS charity rules.
If Black Lives Matter, why aren't we talking about Black fathers? Why aren't we talking about the single motherhood rate in the Black community, which has jumped from 25% to 73% in the Black community? Why aren't we talking about the fact that when you remove fathers from the home, your kid is worse off in life? You're 20 times more likely to end up in prison. Why aren't we talking about the fact that, you're 9 times more likely to drop out of high school? They don't talk about any of this issues because they don't care. They really are just a political arm of the Democratic Party. And by doing these videos, by capturing these moments and talking about the facts, even the people that disagree with me in the Black community, because they feel that they want to disagree with me, they'll go look up the facts and they'll find out that I'm actually telling the truth. How is it plausible that Black Lives Matter is not outside boycotting Planned Parenthood? I don't understand.
This morning, I woke up to Candace Owens being outside of my house with a news crew. She was demanding that I come outside.
Hello. I was just looking to speak to whoever is at this property because it's listed as the Black Lives Matter property. Sir? Hello?
The fact that she's came outside my house and demanded things, harassed me, is unacceptable.
We're not trying to harass you. We'll gladly leave. We're just wondering if we can speak to anybody.
Y'all, I really need my family to be safe. I need to be safe. I need my child to be safe. And this, what happened this morning is not safety.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.
But they throw us a performative bone year by year, whether that's on a TV program, they make an African-American lead in something, they make an announcement, and it's all performative. It's all just performative to make my people feel like we're getting somewhere, but we're actually not. If America cared to heal its country from its discrepancies in human rights errors, which Iran has highlighted with Khomeini, not Khomeini, but with him highlighting these hypocrisies that America tries to play moral authority on the world when they fail to do their own management within their country. That if they wanted to heal race relations in the United States, America would simply apologize for its role in the transatlantic slave trade as a whole. Now they haven't. And I would say in some countries where there's been a national apology, say for Australia, for example, with the Aborigines people, they might have done it for quote unquote performative reasons for the Olympics, but it put a consciousness within the Australian people to go, let me be mindful of how I talk to people of Aborigines culture. So if America really wanted to make change, they would do that, but they haven't. My country profits very well off division. Division has been something that's been mass marketed in America since slave plantations. That's how they were able to control Africans that they did traffic, was creating division on plantations. Whether that was through colors of mixed race Africans that they might have raped, or whether that was through giving privilege to certain Africans and putting some in the house and some out in the field. That has been an ongoing theme in America. America, I call it the divided states. Nothing united about that place at all. So if they wanted to truly heal the race relations there, they would have, and they see not to. They kick the crumbs underneath the carpet, and then there's these complaints as molding and smelling, but it's because there hasn't been any real true effort to address its history in human rights violations. So what I'm saying is they've exploited a lot of Americans in multiple different ways to keep us in a perpetual state of outrage, because it's easy to manage a population if you keep the people at what they deem the bottom fighting while they pass laws and policies on our behalf. And we're too busy fighting about genders, race, feminism, polarizing genders, that is leaving children vulnerable at the end of the day. Now, what I saw in Iran with Mahsa Amini, it bothered me. And this was a video that came out from Israel. And I will show you that video here.
We support Iranian women.
We support you.
Israel love you.
The women of Israel will always stand with you.
We will always remember you, Mahsa.
We will never forget you.
We will never forget you.
Every woman deserves to be free. You are in our hearts.
After seeing that video, it bugged me because Israel has had a constant battle with Iran of covert ops where they've been attacking Iran, as recently as of the last 2 weeks.
Today on the newscast, a major Israeli airstrike against Iranian assets inside Syria, and Russia condemns. Get all the breaking details from Jerusalem next.
اما یه پدافندم هوا کردن نمیدونم چیه یه پهباد بود درسته؟ یه پهباده
دشمنان ملت ایران برای ناامن سازی جمهوری اسلامی ایران و ناامن سازی کشورمون انجام دادند، این اقدام بزدلانه امروز انجام شده. دستگاه امنیتی ما با اقتدار در راستای تأمین حداکثری امنیت ملی کشور عمل می‌کنند و چنین اقداماتی نمیتونه تأثیری در اراده و نیت متخصصین ما برای پیشرفت‌های هسته‌ای صلح آمیز بر جای بگذاره.
What's the greatest threat right now that Israel faces?
Iran. You want the three threats?
Give me the three threats.
Iran, Iran, Iran.
There's been operations that have constantly been taking place. And what I saw was this polarization of making this a gender related situation when it's a human rights situation. The difference is from being pro-women's rights or pro-men's rights is that when you're pro-human rights, that includes men, women, and children. You're all together underneath the same umbrella. What we call community or common unity. If you have common unity, you can all see each other's differences and see how it all relates to each and every one of you. That's how I feel as an African being able to speak on this situation, because I see the common unity of how Iranians are being affected and they've also been exploited. So when I see this polarization between genders, Iranian men are being killed at the same rate as Iranian women. So I don't necessarily understand why they're particularly specifically polarizing these differences, other than to say they're potentially and almost purposefully running operations to destabilize Iran from within and making it a gender-based situation. And what's the saddest part is I know Reza Shah means a lot to Iranians that may have been outside of Iran, that are based in one of these Western countries where they have the privilege of looking at Iran as a bad regime. But what I'm trying to say is, even if you try to deem Iran's regime as bad, the Reza Shah, the last Shah, was placed in power because he was unfortunately a puppet of the CIA. People don't want to admit that, but that is a fact. He was a puppet put in place, authorized by the CIA.
This is in the heart of one of the most populated and congested cities in the world. These pristine grounds I'm walking through, these fountains and palace, take up more than 160,000 square meters of downtown Tehran. Inside the walls of these buildings, evidence of an opulent lifestyle. This palace has been converted into a museum, reminding the new generation why their parents had fought the revolution. For years, this was the home of Iran's royal family.
It's more than a little ironic that what used to be one of the most exclusive palaces of the Shah and his family is now a park where you can come and stroll with your family and friends. But it's the opulence of the place that really hits you, and its sheer scale. It feels like it's a private country residence, but in the heart of a city. And it's little wonder that the Shah who lived here would have felt so isolated and removed from the lives of ordinary Iranians beyond the walls of this palace.
Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the self-proclaimed King of Kings, ruled Iran from 1941. Replacing his father, who was deposed when Britain and the Soviet Union occupied Iran during the Second World War. The new Shah, it was believed, would be more malleable to their needs, allowing for more control of such a strategically placed oil-rich country. But the Shah's closeness to foreign powers always made Iranians question his legitimacy.
And this was the Achilles heel of the monarchy, was that the monarchy was really brought to power by first the British and therefore beholden to imperial power. And the only way nationalists could really reassert authority over Iran was to get rid of the Pahlavi monarchy.
The seeds of discontent were planted early in the Shah's reign. The most important natural resource, oil, was in British hands. The rights bought at the turn of the 20th century for a mere fraction of their true worth. Most Iranians who worked in the oil fields in Abadan lived in squalor, while the British lived in privilege.
I used to go to the city, go to buy something. I used to stop at the bus stop, which was run by the company. In the heat of the summer, 50 degrees, I used to stand in that bus stop for nearly half an hour. A number of buses would come, but because they had a red tape, it meant that only the British staff, I could not use that bus. I had to wait for the buses which were allowed to take Iranians. There was a famous club in Abadan which the British staff used. And there was a sign outside that club which said dogs and Iranians are not allowed.
The fiercely nationalist, democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had made it his mission to nationalize Iran's oil, threatened British control of the industry. With the Cold War heating up, his socialist leanings were also seen as a menace by the US, who feared Iran might gravitate towards the Soviet bloc. The British and Americans agreed Mossadegh had to be removed.
There were many people who saw Mossadegh as a hero, and others who were very dubious about him, who thought he was more of a demagogue. But the way in which, of course, he was treated by the West, the machinations against him, reinforced, let's put it this way, the Iranian perception that their country was constantly interfered with by foreign powers.
The CIA engineered coup of 1953 put the Shah firmly in power. Mossadegh lived out his days in his family home under house arrest. Iran's modern-day political hero was silenced. So was any talk of the former leader.
I think Mossadegh was very popular, to the day he was overthrown, and therefore, once he was overthrown, became virtually a non-person in Iran in 1960. So this is 7 years after the overthrow of Mossadegh, and you could still not mention Mossadegh by name in the newspapers or in the press, because the government, the Shah too, wanted him forgotten.
But for the Shah's opponents, Mossadegh would never be forgotten. And as the Shah forged closer ties with Western governments, anti-American sentiment increased.
The Shah's mistake was that he himself didn't make decisions. Instead, they were made by foreign counselors, especially the American counselors, who had the fundamental role of planning things for the Shah.
To critics, it appeared that he was more concerned with cultivating an extravagant lifestyle than with running the country. He and his family were frequently pictured in the company of some of the world's most influential people, often hosting parties of spectacular opulence. In 1963, the Shah announced an ambitious modernization program.
It seems to me around that period, the kind of stranglehold that the events of 1953, the overthrow of Mossadegh, had over the regime were broken, and the Shah felt much freer then to experiment a little bit on his own.
The so-called White Revolution included plans for land redistribution as well as extensive social reforms. And for the first time, women would be allowed to vote. The Shah, a lifelong fan of Western culture, appeared to be imposing Western ideals upon Iran.
Ours is a policy of participation embracing all men and women, which sometimes go further than those of even, for instance, the Scandinavian countries. We are not too concerned about what others might think of the system. The results speak for themselves.
There is no doubt that land reform changed the face of Iranian society. It took a feudal economy and turned it into a capitalist modern economy.
But these reforms were not well received by all in Iran. They eroded the influence of landowners and the clergy, and many clerics were outraged.
Land was not redistributed. They sold the uncultivated lands to deprived farmers. It wasn't given away. They had to pay in installments for 15 years. The peasants were left with nothing and abandoned their villages and lost their way of life. The Shah did not do anything to benefit the people.
One religious scholar was particularly critical, insisting that the White Revolution was aimed at bolstering foreign interests in Iran and further eroding its Shia traditions. Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Mossavi Khomeini said that the only white thing about this revolution was the influence of the White House.
It's often said that in '63 it was the White Revolution, land reform, women's rights that triggered off the Khomeini movement. Those are partly true, but I think more important was in '63 the Shah gave extraterritorial rights to American military officials. And this then fitted into this nationalist perception that the Shah was not really a patriot. The term Khomeini used that had resonated, that this was a capitulation to Western imperialism.
Khomeini's criticism of the reforms and of the Shah was harsh and uncompromising, as was the Shah's response. Khomeini was arrested and imprisoned, sparking off protests in the holy city of Qom, where Khomeini was based. These soon spread to cities across Iran, a sure sign of Khomeini's growing popularity. In response, the Shah's security forces launched a crackdown, igniting even more protests throughout the country.
It was in part spontaneous, once Khomeini was arrested, and in part, of course, instigated by his own clerical followers, people in the bazaar. And the arrest of this, quote, holy man touched on a nerve with many in the population.
Khomeini was exiled, his life spared because of his respected religious status. With the cleric in Iraq, the Shah pressed ahead with his modernization program. The country initially prospered, but the over-ambitious plans were soon to fragment Iranian society, and the seeds of discontent started to bloom. The exile of Ayatollah Khomeini coincided with a period of relative prosperity for Iran.
I think the decade between 1963 and 1973 was what you might call a decade of good management. The economy did very well, inflation was kept very low, prosperity did filter down to the new middle class, educational opportunities expanded very rapidly for everyone. True, obviously income distribution was not equal or fair, but everybody did better.
The Shah attempted to capitalize on this economic success by cementing his position as the nation's undisputed leader. Having marginalized Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, at least for the moment, the Shah turned his attention to Iran's left-wing opposition. With the Cold War at its height and the Soviet Union, Iran's most powerful neighbor, the Shah was determined to stem the growing popularity of communism and socialism. He toured the country warning of the threat.
I belong to the generation of the national movement and Mossadeghi's movement and the movement for democracy and for independence. We were the ones who tried to resist the Shah, and they had completely suppressed all political movements, all political parties. And even in the late 50s and early 60s, when National Front was trying to reorganize, the SAVAK did its best to destroy the new National Front.
SAVAK, Iran's internal security service, had been established in 1957 with the help of Mossad and the CIA. Its methods of widespread arrests, torture, and executions soon created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation.
What SAVAK had successfully done is to create an image of itself as far more powerful than it in fact was. Our working assumption in Iran was that in any group of 4 or 5, one person would be a SAVAK. These turn out to be exaggerations. But was SAVAK brutal? Yes, it was. Did it torture? Yes, it did.
According to human rights groups, during the Shah's reign, around 1,000 political opponents were executed, with a further 4,500 imprisoned.
I was abducted. A car stopped and pulled me in. They took me, to be brief, blindfolded, which I later on found out it was Evin prison. I was whipped, then blindfolded again, taken out to the hillsides and thrown over a valley down to the bottom.
SAVAK's methods further contributed to the opposition to the Shah's regime. He was increasingly seen as a dictator who had no tolerance for dissent. Yet the Shah believed that his ambitious economic development plans would help quell any hostility to his stifling of political freedom. Oil revenues, he hoped, would lead to greater prosperity.
The ultimate goal was to build an Iran which would compare to Japan of that time. Obviously, was saying between Japan and Europe, we must be the financial center, the major economy of the world.
And no expense was to be spared in pursuit of this dream. In 1 year alone, 1974, the Shah spent $16 billion on a development plan which aimed to modernize the nation's infrastructure while revamping its military. In order to finance his development goals, the Shah took an active role in OPEC and insisted on imposing a rise in oil prices. His position caused a rift with his former supporters in Washington.
I told him that in Nixon administration, there are people who are turning against him. He thought I'm exaggerating.
But the Shah was undeterred. Indeed, as the country's coffers swelled, he grew still bolder. In 1974, he spearheaded a 14% rise in oil prices that crippled Western economies, insisting it was in Iran's national interest. And it appeared that the Shah was at the height of his powers.
He was now, in 1974, the emperor of oil, the man who'd made it. He was on the scene. Iran was a great power again. And therefore, of course, the nature of the relationship is going to change. People were not going to treat you with the sort of kid gloves, perhaps, that maybe you were used to beforehand. You were no longer emerging, you had emerged. And therefore, if you'd emerged, it was sort of big boys' games, for big boys' rules and big boys' games. And I think the Shah never quite adjusted to this fact.
And as a nation, Iran suffered growing pains as it attempted to modernize too quickly.
The explosion in oil prices in 1973-74, oddly enough, made Iran wealthier overnight, but the Shah's attempt to inject all that money into the economy at once had an enormously disruptive impact on the economy. We went almost overnight from a fairly stable economy to very rapid inflation, housing priced out of the reach of most people, a flooding of migrants from rural areas into the large cities, and therefore the creation of shanty towns and a worker underclass.
The broken promise of prosperity led to increasing resentment against the Shah. People from all walks of life were angered by the new economic hardship and by the corruption seen as endemic in the Shah's inner circle.
Our struggle was mainly aimed at the Shah himself. It wasn't about America or Britain, who were both interfering in our internal affairs. It was all about the Shah, and especially about the Pahlavi family, because the royal court had a great role in plundering our interests, and they also had a role in our lack of freedoms.
But by now, the Shah would brook no criticism. In 1975, Iran became a single-party state, with the Shah confirmed as its all-powerful leader.
He became increasingly hubristic towards the politics of the country. He established a one-party state. In 1975, he changed the calendar. In 1976, I mean, he did all these things really without any rhyme or reason, rather really to support his own political ideas. And of course, this all offended many, many people. It was a confluence of bad decisions.
Yet the Shah remained convinced he had the support of religious clerics who he believed were united against communist elements. It was to prove a fatal miscalculation.
The mistake the US made in Afghanistan in 80s, thinking that the bin Ladens of the world are potential allies against Soviet Union, the Shah made in the 60s and 70s. He strengthened the clergy, thinking that they would fight the communists.
One of the Shah's fiercest critics had a far-reaching influence on all opposition movements. Even from his exile in Iraq, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini's condemnation of the Shah and his foreign allies was resonating through the very heart of Iran, fomenting the protests that would quickly develop into a revolutionary movement.
Inside Iran, any voice of opposition was crushed brutally. Khomeini was exiled, and from there he had this freedom to speak out against the Shah. No one inside could dare to do that. Therefore, gradually, he became the main speaker of the opposition inside Iran, and he was continuously attacking the Shah's brutality.
And the people would soon begin to desert the Shah.
When things went bad, he ran. He ran and he fled the country. Not that I'm trying to call him a coward or a bad, but he fled at the first sign of trouble. And he also fled because he tried to nationalize the oil. He had became very arrogant and very, I would say, pageantry-ish for what some people in Iran felt was unflattering. For what was considered glory days for some Iranians wasn't so glory days for people who didn't have as much. There were people that were struggling, and he would run these massive parades and events, and it made people feel like it was a westernized show of things that didn't quite match up with morals and values. It was a westernized influence of trying to present the regalness of what would be considered privilege to a Western sense. And so that was a huge disconnect with his people while he was underneath and ruling the country. 20 years of movie theaters and westernized culture, it seems like it's almost affected in Iran in a way where people will not acknowledge history that took place before the last Shah was in power. A lot of Iranians that I've spoken to outside of the country don't even recognize Mossadegh and what he cared about and what he tried to contribute to his people in the coup that took place in 1953. Another great documentary to check out is one called Coup 53, which explains about Mossadegh's connection to Iran. Also with Mossadegh, it is rumored he had family that was based in Zanzibar, in Tanzania, in Africa, and that was his connection to Africa as well, which goes back to Shirazi people and their unique stamp on, I would say, the world, and also for Africa, because it's just a different part of Iranian history that's not covered. So what I'm trying to say is, all of these topics are very challenging to discuss with Iranians, because you can't come to a logical conclusion when you omit parts of history that have taken place because you favor one leader over another. And I think that's very detrimental and almost devastating to understand. You won't be able to come to a consensus unless you can realize the full frame picture that you're looking at. That picture that you're looking at is that history is valid. You cannot omit history. If you're sitting in the middle of a forest and you're trying to give directions, you're not able to give directions unless you know where you came from. Knowing where you came from doesn't mean you can skip over certain steps you didn't like to know how you got and what led you to this point, to understand what led Iranians to this point in their history. So I would suggest to Iranian people in a very significant way, if you can, acknowledge the history of your country in its entirety. Be willing to accept the US and British involvement in your country. This is no different from British, French, American, and Russian involvement in breaking up the tribes in the Middle East, the Arab tribes that all didn't have these borders. They didn't have Syria, they didn't have Yemen. All these borders that were broken up and put into place after European influence of colonization that had taken place. And be willing to admit, that there was outside influence, and this outside influence, it's valid to examine what that means. Is it really your people that is leading the forefront of your country, or is it really outside entities running what they call disinformation or misinformation? Essentially, those words are new words for propaganda. Propaganda has been changed into buzzwords of disinformation and misinformation. But who's the biggest propagator of disinformation or misinformation? Most of the time, it can be one's government. And we can look back and view that based around the pandemic and different instructions that we were given. Wear one mask, wear two masks. The vaccine will protect you from catching COVID. Now, no, actually it won't protect you from catching COVID. Oh, it's got a 90% safety rate. Oh, no, now it's a 70% safety rate. Oh, now it's a 40% safety rate. Maybe you go get a booster. So, all of these things are valid, that you have to hold your government accountable for some of the things that they say. But what I want to explain to you about Iran's government is that it's gone through a number of changes. And of course, police brutality is unacceptable. Obviously, America has a huge hypocrisy when it comes to that, which also the current leader of Iran highlighted as well with Khamenei. But police brutality and police corruption is international. You can see that right now with maybe the likes of what's happening in Romania with Andrew Tate.
So why is society doing this to men and women?
If you're breaking down the home, the best and quickest way to do that is attacking the woman. And there's more money in lonely, sad women. We consume everything. So if I get to a certain age and I'm not married, I'm going to be more likely to be on prescription drugs. I'm going to be more likely to attend to surgery. I'm going to be more likely to just indulge. Whereas when you have a purpose, those things all take a back burner. So that's why I think it's completely designed to make more money and to destroy the home and make people dependent on, then your God becomes social media. When you don't have a God and when you don't have a stable home, your God becomes society. The laws determine your morality. And the quicker they can get you to believe that God doesn't exist and the law is your source of morality, the quicker they can control you.
When you listen to his long-form content, do you find him to be more of a positive influence than a negative? Or how do you wind up feeling in terms of his influence on men and society at large? Positive or negative?
Absolute net positive. I don't see anything that's a net negative. I see all of the net positive for him. For getting men to get in shape. You kidding me? Our testosterone level has dropped since 1980. Every year our testosterone levels dropped 1% for that age category. Not every year like when I'm 35, then 36, 37. Every year the average male's testosterone level has dropped. Our PSI, okay, on how strength or grip strength is, it's dropped from 1985. It was at 116. Right now it's 96. For women, it's gone from 79 to 98. How's that even possible? Women have stronger grip strength than men in many cases. How is that even possible? How is that even happening?
I think Andrew is amazing for men. I think right now there are no male role models. Of course, there's Jordan Peterson, who's amazing, but he's not going to relate to the young boys. So I think he's absolutely amazing. The tons of messages that I've received from young boys just saying thank you so much for supporting him. He's saved my life. He's done all these amazing things. And I think he might be extreme to some standards. However, he's allowing the pendulum to move the other way. Society went so the other way. It went so liberal and so woke that we actually need a crazy character like Andrew to bring us back to normality. And I think even he would admit, hopefully men will end somewhere in the middle, more to his side obviously, but end somewhere in the middle.
Because young people look up to philosophers, to influencers about what it means to be a man. They look up to Jordan Peterson, they look up to Andrew Tate, they looked up to others. What does it mean to be a good man in the society?
Some people, in order to make a change in their life, need someone who they can look up to. Andrew Tate would encourage you to go reach for the stars, I guess. Men don't have a lot of strong role models, big male presences in their life who can serve as a proper example. There's certainly a need for somebody kind of to speak to a younger generation.
And then you have young people who are sitting there broke with big dreams. They need the mentors. They need somebody to inspire them. You have to realize there needs to be institutions or people or influencers that help inspire. You were a member of Hustlers University. So
yeah, I joined. I became a hustler. That's in large part due to why I'm so successful is because of my Hustler University membership. What Andrew Tate is selling is not multi-level marketing. There's several rooms and each one is a different field of making money. E-commerce, trading, cryptocurrency, fulfillment by Amazon, copywriting.
Is the Hustler University still operating?
I think they've rebranded it.
TheRealWorld.ai. People underestimate how important influence is. The war in Ukraine and Russia right now is what? People are dying. Machines of war are out in a field somewhere, blowing people to smithereens. So that one country can get influence over land. So to say, this area uses this currency and you read our newspaper, we have influence. Influence is the bottom line of everything. It always has been. That's what wars are fought for. It's what the media machine exists for. It's why the YouTube algorithms are rigged. It's why elections are fucking... I don't want to get killed. It's why elections are very fair. It's all influence.
You can see that with what's happened in the United States, and they're still releasing videos of African Americans being attacked, but they haven't made a national apology to maybe put a consciousness in the American public as a whole to be mindful of how we treat each other. And that's not by accident, that they're not aware that they could do that. They could apologize as a country, and it might make some conscious and personal change among the people. But with Iran and what's going on and with Mahsa Amini, police brutality is unacceptable, but unfortunate. It's a part of almost every police department globally. Police in Britain and also in London and also in the United States, in Boston, the very first modern police departments in Boston and London were formed in 1830. And they were formed not to protect the community. Police forces were established what they called during the Industrial Revolution. For some people, they might call that the industrial exploitation. Modern police forces were formed to essentially put a stop to unions from being formed. These corporations that were being formed out of industrial revolutions had these massive factories. And in order to protect their factories that were so huge and they had so many workers working off assembly lines, in order to manage it, the corporations got fed up and they wanted to form police forces to absolve themselves of having to manage all of these workers, potentially forming unions and protesting. What the job of the police force was to do was they created a class issue, and they created different classes, and essentially they needed to create an underclass. These underclass were considered either poor migrants, poor drunkards, or just immigrants, which I said earlier as migrants. But most of those categories that were deemed underclass in those brackets were all the same workers that were working in these factories. So police were made and purposely intentionally protect commercial interests. Police were never formed, modern day police, to protect the community. You might see that slapped on the side of a police car, that it's for the community and we're here to protect and serve. But police, when you see a protest going on, you see what their true intentions are. Their true intentions are to protect commercial interest from their buildings being harmed. So if it comes down to citizens or corporations, you will find out very fast that the police isn't necessarily there for the community. And you can even address that in your local country for the most part. Say in maybe perhaps where I'm located in New Zealand or in Australia. Police show up after the fact of a crime. They're not there for crime prevention. They show up after a crime has actually been committed. In New Zealand specifically, if it gets bad, that's the only time that they turn up, once an assault or some sort of crime has taken place. Now, if you call them prior and you say someone appears to be violent, they may not show up at all, which is unfortunate, but they're there almost to just show up, like I said, after the fact, which essentially makes them higher paid security guards. They're not actually there for crime prevention. So what I'm saying to you is that that's a global problem with police force. And if you want true change, let that change come from within Iran, for the Iranian people to discuss that. Now, whether that's best done through protest is questionable. Today, modern day protests are essentially exploitation, things that take place for corporations to monetize their profits off of. So they'll support social movements. Corporations co-opt social movements, whether that's Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, gender, women's rights. And a lot of this is done now for ESG, which is economic social governance, which is essentially it's a corporate social credit score that corporations are meant to withhold. So you go into corporate buildings and you see genderless bathrooms in a Western country. It's not because there's genuine change coming through. It's because it's socially engineered, it's manufactured, and it's being done so these corporations can be able to borrow more money because they're beholden to companies, say, like BlackRock, which enforces ESG in the World Economic Forum. So it's not coming from a very genuine place, down to movies and television with this quote-unquote diversity, where they're falsely making the world homogenous, and race swapping, which is causing social conflict, and it keeps the general public busy going, why is this happening? Why is there an African aerial? And these politicians are able to pass policies while we're too caught up in the distractions,
Look at this. Right-wingers melt down over satanic Pfizer-sponsored Grammys. I almost feel like this is too on the nose. I almost feel like we're all being played against each other, while these people are like just finding ways to control us and control all the money. I feel like this is all fake. I know it's real. I know that was a real song, and I know that's a real commercial afterwards, but it just seems so stupid. Someone in the World Economic Forum, some fucking billionaire that's running the world's like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get these people fighting while I institute some sort of a gigantic global social credit score system. If AI is real already, if artificial intelligence is real already and it's manipulating us, that's how it manipulates us. Just get us to fight over the dumbest shit.
Which is why I think Andrew Tate has become such an enormous threat to the system. Yes. This guy is in the way of really bad people who recognize that it's an absolute necessity to weaken men to do what they want to do. Because who's going to be on the front lines of saying, no, you're not going to take my property? I'm not putting my child into an indoctrination camp. That's going to be the man. It's not going to be the woman in that house. So they need those feminized men who are going to be, oh, really? Maybe I can line up for another six-pack scene. You know, like that nonsense is what they need.
I'll tell you something about like the whole woke ideology is that it's based around this idea of trying to make everybody equal. And in nature, things are unequal. Some people are 6'3", some people are 5'10". Nature isn't fair, okay? So there's never going to be perfect equality. And the only way you can make people truly equal is by dragging somebody else down to your level.
Oh my gosh, so that 4 years from 2016 to 2020, it was a complete madness. I became very pessimistic about the Western world after university because literally in these humanity classes, even the economics, I was studying economics for 2 years and later human rights. The professor would send me the emails. Oh, this class we're gonna cover this. If it triggers you, you don't have to come to the class or don't even do the reading. I'm a rape survivor. I'm a slave. I've gone through so many things, and they say, oh, this can trigger the rape. This can trigger this, and then before the class they say, let's go through what do you want to be called, your pronouns. And my English is not that good. I sometimes mistakenly call him or she, and then they started asking me to say they, and then I don't know how to incorporate in my English that pronoun properly. And it made me so nervous to talk in the classroom. And one day I got into a fight with my professor. She was saying, the fact that you're letting men holding door for you is you are giving in to their overpowering you. And I was like, no, isn't it kindness? Is it decency? I hold the door for people too. It's not like I'm trying to signal that I'm powerful than you. And she was like, you're so brainwashed from North Korea. And I was a scenario, of course my GPA is gonna be affected. And it's like, okay, I gotta really shut up. I gotta try to do my best to get to Korea. And I was a scenario, of course my GPA is gonna be affected. And it's like, okay, I gotta really shut up. I gotta try to do my best to get a good GPA. So that 4 years, I learned to censor myself all over again.
Give them a little bit of Starbucks, give them a little TV programming, tell a vision, and keep them busy. So you need to be privy to know how the world works, and that there's agendas going on all around, and Iran in general has been notoriously exploited. So my wish and desire for the Iranian people is that true change comes from within your people, not from the help of an outside entity who may not have your best interest in mind, and you will become an indentured servant to whoever you're asking for help from. You want true freedom. True freedom comes from within. It comes from your own people finding your own independence. And I would ask for Iranians to have the privilege of, or perceived privilege, to be in a Western country, to think more kindly of your own people and not be so quick to not only denounce Iran without factoring out how Iran has gone through so much change from outside forces, but not try to hinder the Iranians in the country from feeling like they're missing out. Your country and your culture has privilege of a beautiful history, and that has credence to it. And it's not something to omit because you've assimilated to a Western country where you've come. Some Iranians go into these Western countries and they leave Iran because they felt that their people were being prejudged or abused or harassed or judged upon or even killed. And so they flee Iran, and sometimes they go into a foreign country and have that same bias and that same hesitation and same prejudice that they receive, they purport that out on other ethnic groups when they get into these Western countries. I've had a unique interaction between, like I said, various types of Iranians. The biggest, I would say, group that I've had the most challenge with as far as Iranians has been Baha'is. And Baha'is it was pretty shocking to me because I don't want to paint all of them in a quick brush, but I felt that they tended towards me to be the most judgmental about me and about other people that weren't a part of their quote unquote group. And almost every religion can be that way. You can get involved and get a religious gang mentality of we're here, they're there, we're cleaner, they're not, and lose your humanity to connect with people and understand that we all have privileges and differences, and we all have a beautiful history and things that we can contribute to each other. We all can learn from each other and exchange personal development, hence why I'm speaking about the subject matter. And I could not care. I could look at this as just, oh, this is Iranians' problems, and this is just their people's problems. But, it's not only for the fact that I have a half Iranian son, but this has been in my heart prior to my son being president, that I've cared about the globe from a very pure purpose. I would say it's because African Americans face so much persecution in our own country that we can't even afford to be prejudiced towards other people. We're almost very opening to almost everyone because we have a lot to learn, and we had a lot to learn being stripped of our identity, our connection to Africa, our native tongue, our spirituality, our connection with earth and the soil. And so we're often assembly line African Americans. So our people are still kind of lost and trying to find our way. So I've always cared to want to learn about other cultures specifically. And so I hope people don't take this in offense of me taking the time to speak about this, but I thought it was very important that I discuss this because everything that happens on this planet, we're all affected. Whether that's what's going on in Ukraine with Russia and the United States. Russia has not expanded towards the United States or towards NATO. NATO has expanded towards their border. Russia's only doing what any sovereign country would do, which is protect your border. This is no different from if Russia wanted to form an alliance with China and build bases, and not just China, but make an alliance with Mexico and build bases on the border of Mexico.
И здесь опять лгут постоянно, извращают исторические факты, не прекращают нападки на нашу культуру, на русскую православную церковь, другие традиционные религиозные организации нашей страны. Посмотрите, что они делают со своими собственными народами. Разрушение семьи, культурной и национальной идентичности, извращение, издевательства над детьми вплоть до педофилии объявляются нормой их жизни. А священнослужители, священников принуждают благословлять однополые браки. Да Бог с ними, пускай что хотят, то и делают. Что здесь хочется сказать? Взрослые люди имеют право жить, как хотят. Мы к этому так и относились в России, и всегда к этому будем так относиться. Никто в частную жизнь не вторгается, и мы не собираемся этого делать. Но хочется им сказать, посмотрите, извините меня, Священное Писание, главные книги всех других мировых религий. Там все сказано, в том числе то, что семья – это союз мужчины и женщины. Но и эти священные тексты подвергаются сейчас сомнению. Но вот, как стало известно, англиканская церковь, например, планирует, правда, пока только еще, рассмотреть идею гендерно-нейтрального Бога. Что скажешь? Прости, Господи, не ведают, что творят. Миллионы людей на Западе понимают, что их ведут к настоящей духовной катастрофе. Элиты, прямо надо сказать, просто сходят с ума, и это, похоже, уже не лечится. Но это их проблемы, как я уже сказал, а мы обязаны защитить наших детей. И мы сделаем это, защитим наших детей от деградации и вырождения.
America would be in a nuclear war the next day because that is an infringement on the border and the sovereignty of the United States. So right now they're trying to make the world all homogenous. They're trying to make everyone all the same. They're trying to push everyone's Western ideals on every country globally, and it's not respecting the sovereignty of the beauty that each individual country has to contribute to the earth. Your culture is valid. You don't have to do what Americans are doing or what ancient Greeks are doing and what was their culture. Africa doesn't need to assimilate to Greek culture or European traditions or sexual lifestyle as much as a vegan doesn't need to assimilate to becoming a meat eater or people that have the luxury of becoming a vegetarian. But it's just important to respect people's own sovereignty, and I think Iranians need to have their own sovereignty. But please, I would ask the people of Iran that are outside of Iran, have empathy for people that are in Iran. Don't call every Iranian, that is outside of Iran as someone that is a spy or not a good person. I don't even understand the protests to try to close down embassies where they have Iranians that want to go back and see their families. Why would you try to close down diplomatic relations for negotiation? Silencing people is the worst thing that you can do because it stops the ability for peace talks, which is what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment. Russia's came to the table multiple times asking for negotiations. Ukraine has sort of tiptoed around it, and America and NATO have shut down cooperation.
Putin said this in an interview. They said, "What do you think of Trump?" He said, "I've been through 3 US presidents, and they all have amazing ideas. The ideas don't get implemented because people don't understand how strong the bureaucracy of America is. When the people with the dark suits arrive and explain to him how things are really done, his ideas will not come to fruition." Putin said himself, the president has people above him telling him what to do.
But Adam Schiff doesn't talk about Joe Biden and his son walking away with millions of dollars from Ukraine.
Somebody ought to look at whether or not Joe Biden had the prosecutor fired in an improper way.
Republicans have been pointing a lot of fingers at former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter's dealings in Ukraine. Trump and his GOP allies claim Biden used his power as vice president to help his son by withholding foreign aid from Ukraine in order to pressure the government to fire a top prosecutor. Vice President Joe Biden traveled to Ukraine to meet with government leaders and spearhead U.S.-Ukrainian anti-corruption efforts. In April of that year, Hunter Biden had just taken a job with Burisma Holdings, a Ukrainian oil and gas company with ties to the pro-Russian Ukrainian government. As a member of Burisma's board of directors, Hunter Biden's primary duty was to attend board meetings and energy forums in Europe.
Hunter Biden and other members of the Biden family are obviously private citizens, and where they work does not reflect an endorsement by the administration.
Then in February of 2015, Viktor Shokin was sworn in as Ukraine's prosecutor general. He pledged to root out corruption and said Burisma was one of several entities he planned to investigate as part of that effort. But critics say Shokin did the opposite and was actually aiding corrupt actors by blocking investigations, including the UK-led inquiry into Burisma. Vice President Biden publicly called for his ouster, even saying the U.S. withheld $1 billion in loan guarantees to Ukraine to get Shokin fired.
I said, you're not getting the billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Fox News alert, Elon Musk highlighting documents on Twitter's censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story. Newly released details from journalist Matt Taibbi, who Musk outsourced the findings to, tweeted, the decision was made at the highest levels of the company, but without the knowledge of CEO Jack Dorsey. He was asleep at the wheel.
Jim Jordan now, let's watch.
Twitter didn't give me access to my laptop, but Special Agent Chan has said publicly, and the FBI has confirmed, that those documents did not relate to Hunter Biden, and that's my recollection of them.
What did they relate to?
My interactions with Agent Chan and with the FBI almost entirely focused on what the FBI called malign foreign interference, things like Russian troll farms and Iranian involvement in the elections, not on any type of domestic
Any of the
activity.
information on there classified?
No, sir, I do not hold a security clearance, and so I would not have received any classified information.
Who does hold a security clearance? I'll just go to the second email here. I'm just curious about this. What I propose is that 30 days out from the election, this is another email to you from Mr. Chan. 30 days, we get temporary clearances. You pick who they are. Who were the people at Twitter who had a security clearance?
To be honest, sir, I'm not sure, and we never ultimately followed through on this plan to get temporary clearances.
Did anyone at Twitter have a security clearance?
It's my understanding that at least some current or former employees did hold clearances, but I wasn't certain about that.
Ms. Gaddy, do you know if anyone took up Mr. Chan's offer to hand out security clearances 30 days before the 2020 election?
Not that I'm aware.
So we don't know how many people had security clearances. Twitter, do we know? Mr. Baker, Mr. Gaddy, Ms. Gaddy, anyone know how many people at Twitter had a security clearance in the 30 days prior to the election?
I don't know the answer to that question,
Ms.
sir.
Gaddy?
I do not know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there was ever, if there's ever a time where our government becomes the sole arbiter of truth, then we've lost the United States. Twitter's become the virtual town square. It now has the power to transform public opinion like no other medium in history, with their algorithms shaping and molding the public mind to their own ends. Mr. Roth, to the best of your knowledge, what percentage of your colleagues when you worked at Twitter donated to Democratic causes or candidates in 2020?
I don't know, sir.
We have it here. It was 98.4% of Twitter employees gave to Democratic candidates or causes in the 2020 election cycle.
For the record, Mr. Baker, Ms. Gotti, Mr. Roth, Mr. Navaroli, are you here under the advice of counsel, and do you have counsel present?
Yes, sir.
That was a yes?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I do.
Yes, I was subpoenaed
That's
to
good
appear.
to know. I'm glad you all have counsel present. Mr. Chairman, for the for submission for the record, I'd like consent to submit the Twitter files dated December the 8th, posted by the New York Post regarding the suppression of conservative commentators. Like that submitted.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to also submit for the record a timeline of events with cited sources outlining strong evidence of the Biden family organized criminal actions would certainly indicate that we've crossed the threshold of reasonable suspicion. I'd like this timeline submitted for the record.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, where is that from, that timeline?
Timeline in my hand, boss. I'll get it to you shortly. Bottom line is that the FBI had the Biden crime family laptop for a year. They knew it was leaking. They knew it would hurt the Biden campaign. So the FBI used its relationship with Twitter to suppress criminal evidence being revealed about Joe Biden 1 month before the 2020 elections. You, ladies and gentlemen, interfered with the United States of America 2020 presidential election, knowingly and willingly. That's the bad news. It's going to get worse because this is the investigation part. Later comes the arrest part.
When Trump got in office and he mentioned that there's a deep state, they're like, you can't say that. What are you doing? And when he said, hey, when they asked him, why are you leaving your troops in Syria? And he said, for the oil. They're like, you can't. He goes, no, it's for the oil. No, it's for liberty. It's for helping the people.
Yeah.
No, it's for the oil. It's our oil. And so he let the cat out of the bag, and they can't have that. That's what he blew the whistle on what's actually going on. Our wars are for oil. Our wars are economic wars, just like what's happening in Ukraine. This is an economic war. We're trying to put a hurt and isolate Russia. We're afraid of Russia and their natural resources and their manpower coming together with Germany with their technology and their capital. And we've been saying that for decades. And so that's why we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And that's why this Ukraine war is happening. And people have no idea what's happening. And what's worse is they have no idea that they have no idea what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. That's the crazy part. Can you play this clip? It's so interesting. When you watch this, the guy that's asking the questions is so calm and poised, and he gets rattled. Watch this.
To look at this and say the reason that the Russian army is on NATO, the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is because NATO has expanded rather than the Russians expanding. That, in other words, NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO. Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
Okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for.
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army. It's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to moved
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern
I'm pretty
states.
sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed,
It's not
Okay.
changed, but I'm
So,
pretty sure the movement by Russia is
has
Russia's
NATO
decision.
if NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved, not
NATO
because
is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
Watch.
Unfortunately, for 50 years, it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So
Where's
do you
the
not
Soviet
understand
Union?
it? So do you not understand how, or can you not even see how the Russians will perceive it as a threat? And the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border while their troops, I mean, the places where their troops are, you say their troops are, and may have been in Ukraine and Georgia, are not NATO members.
I'm not going to pretend to know what goes in President Putin's mind or Russian military commanders. I mean, I barely got a history degree at the University of South Florida. What I can tell you, is that NATO is a defensive alliance. It remains a defensive alliance.
Fair enough, but it has moved east, correct? I mean, that's just a
It
fact.
has expanded, absolutely.
Right, exactly.
But
And so
there's
the
no reason for anybody to think the expansion is a hostile or threatening move. And we've been saying that throughout the last 15 years, man.
It's like you're moving closer to Russia. You're blaming the Russians for being close to NATO.
No.
That's exactly what Hegel
We're
said.
blaming the Russians for violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine and destabilizing the security
Which is
situation
not a
inside
NATO
Europe.
member. Which is not a NATO member.
I see to you
Other
on that
countries
point.
feel threatened.
There was a peace agreement in 2014. The CIA helped overthrow the Ukraine government. And then the people in the Donbass didn't want to go along with this coup government, right? Because the leader of Ukraine wanted to be friendlier economically with Russia instead of join like the European Union. And that they couldn't have that, right? So that's why they did a coup. And the people, the Russian speakers in the Donbass didn't want to go along with that coup. And so they kind of wanted to break away. Ukraine government started shelling the Donbass. And so they had a peace agreement called the Minsk Agreement. And that was supposed to give them independence. They were supposed to have their own elections and they were going to stop shelling them. They never did. They ended up killing like 14 or 15,000 people in the Donbass over the last 8 years. And now it's been revealed that that peace agreement was never real. The Merkel, the former prime minister of Germany, just admitted that the only reason they did that peace agreement was to give Ukraine enough time to build up its military so when they finally did provoke an invasion, which is what they did, that they would have a military ready to fight Russia. And so people don't know this is what happened. And so they just think that one day Putin woke up and said, I want to go invade Ukraine because I'm a maniac. And they think that he's the bad guy. They think that he's acting rationally. We always knew he would do this. In fact, we were counting on him doing this. That's why we did what we did. And they don't know that Ukraine ramped up their bombing right before the war started last year. They doubled their bombing. They were really trying to provoke it, and they did. They provoked it, and The Russian would rather have a peace agreement. The rest of the world would rather have a peace agreement. Not NATO, not Joe Biden, not the military-industrial complex. And so that's where we are. And people don't know that, and that's what that is. That guy's saying, hey, NATO's the ones expanding. The reason why, he said it, the reason why the NATO's army is on the doorstep of Russia is because we moved, not Russia. And it's just obvious that we're the bad guys. The United States are the world's terrorists. We have 1,000 military bases. We have 400 military bases surrounding China since the Korean War. We just added 3 new military bases in the Philippines. They just announced 2 weeks ago. This is how all empires end. We're overextending militarily while we have people living under every bridge. People don't have health care, a living wage. Half the country can't afford a $500 emergency. 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. 50% of wage earners earn $30,000 or less. People go bankrupt when they get sick in this country. We have homeless people everywhere, and that's because our government is 100% corrupted.
It's the same thing with cancel culture. We are meant to exchange and have conversations with each other because we're all affected. And silencing people causes neurosis, mental health. And you're only going to back a person up against the wall to cause them to fight back. Or you'll create an underground subculture. You can look at that with Andrew Tate. You can try to cancel the guy from speaking about biological differences between men and women, men's and women's relations, men's mental health, what's going on with COVID. You can try to suppress this guy. You can even try to run an operation to even take the guy out. But all you're going to do is you're going to create a subculture, and it's going to go underground, and you're not going to stop it. It will still rise up, and it will still be a problem at the end of the day. And it's because you can't impose yourself and your worldview on an entire population. The universe always balances out itself. There's always a balance. When there was a huge rise in feminism coming up, there was an uptick in men coming up talking about men's mental health and men's social issues, and trying to draw a parallel to show this is the way things have been historically, and this is the reason why these things have been tradition between men and women, because you can be easily exploited. Corporations exploit, like I said, ladies all the time for their need for social inclusion. And unfortunately, that right now is what I see being weaponized, and they're turning a human rights into a gender-related issue. So please, I would ask the people of outside of Iran, have empathy for your own people. Understand, acknowledge the history of where you come from. Understand that there are people that do not have your people's best interest in mind.
I want to actually make it very clear that MEK does not represent Iranian people. Iranian people inside the country are brave enough to be their own representative. We are in a direct contact with them, and as Mr. Pahlavi and Nazanin mentioned, in our declaration, in our charter, we actually want to have a secular democracy. Those who do not believe in democracy, those who do not even engage with Iranians, they're not engaging with us to talk directly about what they want for the future of Iran. I'm very, very, very surprised at how they're being welcomed by the member of European Parliament, by some of the senators and member of the congressmen in America. So this is very clear.
You might want freedom for your people in some sort of way, even if it's superficial, and it's the freedom of going to movie theaters and, I don't know, essentially maybe feeling like Turkey, or feeling like that little 20-year period of Iran where you had, movies and you were able to see Gone with the Wind. I don't feel like that is the most important part of a culture. It's what's taking place, I would say, even in the Olympics that happened recently in Qatar. Qataris became very notable for doing that Olympics, for not assimilating to LGBTQ promotion that was going on there. And they didn't do that because they said we deserve to maintain our own sovereignty and our own integrity for how we manage our own country. We have our own beauty and our own uniqueness to that. And Qataris talked to Piers Morgan when he went to Qatar and said, you Westerners, you think we want to be like you, but we don't. we see what's going on in your country, how much division you guys have, how you guys are being exploited, how you guys are fighting over petty issues behind gender, and all of this degenerate dysfunctionality that you guys have taken place. You have children's story time with cross-dressing people and drag queens, and we don't need that. We have our own beauty, we have our own stability, and therefore we don't need your ideals. Also, another thing to bear in mind is that in the Middle East or in any country or whatever, you need allies. Life is about people. It's bigger than just yourself. So the fruit of life is within partnerships, whether that partnership is through a friendship or through a relationship. So you do need like-minded people to come together that have the same values to be able to help your people progress. And so between Sunni and Shia, I know that there's differences between both communities on the way they view imams and over a number of topics, but you do need allies. And unfortunately, it seems as though they're purporting that, some of the women in Iran are seemingly discounting the head covering or wearing of hijabs, which for certain, I'm not for sure how historical that has been an ongoing theme within the Islamic community, within the Shia community, within either Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan or any of these countries that they may have a population of Shia Muslims. But it's just unfortunate that, Iran and some of the ladies in Iran tend to be an outlier in regards to the discrepancy regarding head covering. And so that's something that can be discussed internally within Iran and something to be examined, but please understand that it's almost devaluing not only the religion to some extent, but it's also devaluing your culture. It's almost purporting a stereotype of that women in the Middle East are subjugated, which doesn't reflect well. Obviously, for other communities that are in the Middle East, they may not like the way that that's being purported, that, women that have head coverings seem to be subjugated and you're less than. And it's not flattering, towards other people. So something to bear in mind when talking about these things. Obviously, people shouldn't face any intense sort of violence or harm regarding attire, but there are strict rules in place because of them not wanting too much of a Western influence involved into the East. And the reason for that being is seeing how the West turned out, which in some ways it hasn't turned out in a very productive way. It's a social experiment. It's essentially social engineering. And if you look at the Kim Kardashians, the Cardi B's, these certain figures that should have programs going throughout the schools to show how harmful their message has been towards women, and the way that they've achieved their fame, whether that's Cardi B through, unfortunately, some degenerate activities of, adult film stuff, or her drugging men, or Kim Kardashian, who is the most famous woman on earth, and she's famous for lying that a man leaked her X tape, which unfortunately is not the truth. The truth of the matter is that her and her family conspired for that, and doesn't reflect well on other people that might be of Armenian descent or wherever. You got to understand that you are a cultural representation of your people, and everyone's culture does deserve to be respected, but you're undermining other people's religious beliefs and in some regards if you try to discount some traditional aspects that you have of your culture. And the reason why they have these traditions in place is that women care a lot for social inclusion, and unfortunately that care for social inclusion can mean that there's no limit to the type of things that they want for an experience, so they can feel like they can fit in with the other girl. There's people that are in competition with each other from a social point of view, where they travel for social envy and they try to make themselves look like they're living their best life, and then it purports to another person to feel like they need to go out and go travel as well and do these certain things, and so it has influence. And because of that need for social inclusion, it's almost like there's not really a cap off on what can be a satisfier to a woman, you know. So that's the reason why historically they've had these restrictions in place to try to make sure that women don't get caught up in their own need for self-experience and can stay logical about the bigger point of view, is that your purpose in life is not about your independence. It's about people. It's about partnerships and having a purpose in life, which results in children. Having children does give you purpose, and so it's beyond you. You know, so that's the reason why there are and have been restrictions in place almost in every major religion throughout the world. So it's something to take into mind and value and to behold. So that's why people love the prestige that Middle Eastern people tend to have. And it was my first introduction into seeing a well-structured family and people that have values to themselves. And it's something you shouldn't lose because of fear you're losing out on cinema. Also, feminism might play a role into some of the aspects of things that have happened in Iran. Iran was westernized to a certain degree up until 79, and during the 70s, that's when feminism came into place, and I've touched on how that was a detriment to the African American community and what that caused for our people. It split our people, and we have not recovered from that. Till this day, it is still women versus men fighting for a sense of feeling important, and you're losing the actual biological historical reasons why men and women came together. We're on Earth right now because a man and a woman came together and gave us life. They birthed us. So there's beauty in our bond, and right now they're fracturing that and trying to separate the two and saying that there are differences between us and that we're equal. And there are differences between us, and we're not supposed to be equal. We serve a purpose just like women serve a purpose as well. For an example, in Ukraine right now, with the war taking place, women are able to necessarily either leave or they're staying underneath and they're providing food and rations for the men that are out fighting. Men are on the front line and they're fighting at this war. You know, so if you don't know what your biological role on Earth is, get into a war zone. And you'll find out very quickly who's supposed to be defending the country, who's supposed to be protecting the kids. Women are there to protect children. Men are there to be the first line of defense. And so the burden and the brunt of a lot of stakes is on men in a lot of ways. And, you know, it's our job to contribute and be able to provide on Earth where women and children are loved unconditionally. Men are loved under the condition we can provide something. And until we can provide something, we're not much of any value to the planet. And that's the issue with a lot of young men these days. And the reason why young men were attracted to Andrew Tate and his message, because it was explaining about how to build yourself. And yet there's programs all throughout the UK at the moment that are trying to de-escalate his influence because they're saying it's toxic. Maybe some of the ways that he found his initial start to providing some income obviously weren't ethical from a very religious standpoint or whatever, but he's moved out and he's transitioned from that point in his life, and he's given out very ethical messages on multiple subjects that are across the board, which is why he has peers in the Middle East, whether that's through Tam Cam or other figures that also back up his message, and people that understand his message about historical differences between men and women and traditional gender roles, and how that makes a very safe space for children when children aren't being left vulnerable for drag queen story time. So yeah, so please bear that in mind to keep your allies within the Middle East and keep people with you, you know, because you already have this division between Sunni and Shia, and you don't need any more of that. You need people to be able to back you up and retain your autonomy so that you can be able to be respected and have your own point of view, and it helps balance out the earth, having these differences. You can be a moral juxtaposition when the West is lost in its own way, all right? Acknowledge your beautiful culture, your beautiful history of what you had in Iran, whether you want to view that straight from when Iran became a Shiite country, or if you want to look at that prior to that, back to when Zoroastrianism and Muslims in different countries all lived in relative harmony with each other. and value that, and think about the way in the future you want Iran to move forward in and what that means for your people. I'm sorry for some Iranians whose families felt and faced hard times during the revolution. I have heard stories of someone's mom being assaulted during the revolution, and it caused other people to flee to other countries for whatever reason, whether they fled to Turkey and sought asylum elsewhere and, became refugees and tried to nationalize or themselves inside of another country. I'm really sorry for those stories. Unfortunately, when countries change, there are rules that take place. Me personally, if I knew there was danger happening at protests, I would not have my child at a protest. I do not understand some of these youth students being out at protests and potentially being assaulted, being jailed, and it's exploitation of the youth in general. This is what's going on with Greta Thunberg and her whole purpose, where there's multiple things happening around the world. They just had this incident in Ohio that caused a huge chemical disaster. Do you see Greta Thunberg talking about this? No. They purposely target university-age students, specifically women, for social issues. And they get these women to go out and protest because women care for social inclusion. It's very easy to exploit women. Unfortunately, that plays a part in why, historically, through all major religions, they've had restrictions on women, because women care for social matters. And when you care for social matters, you can lose sight of how you can be disadvantaged and the effects of what, socialism can cause to a certain degree. And some people are unhappy in different countries because of socialism, North Korea being an example.
Do you know how North Korea became how it is today? When Kim Il-sung came, he made one promise to North Korean people. I'm going to feed you rice and meat stew each meal. And I'm going to get rid of all the inequality. If I do that, why don't you give me all your land and all your rights? We wanted no inequality, so we gave our land, our rights to this one guy. He took everything from us. So whenever in America I came, and people in Manhattan, living in the best city in the world, telling me passionately how America is so bad. So I asked them, so what is it so bad about America that you hate so much? And they say, you know what? We have inequality in this country. That's an amazing thing that you can rise to compared to other people. The enemy is poverty, not inequality.
That's what's going on in the West. Whether you want to talk about what's being passed with laws with disinformation, misinformation. It's going on in Canada. It's going on in the US, Australia, New Zealand. Any country part of what they call the Five Eyes surveillance, they're clamping down on what you can even speak about. If you want to talk about a society that is being socialized and forced to do things, it's happening everywhere. So you're going to be underneath someone's rule. You're always going to be underneath someone's system. But you may lose your identity if you ask for outside help. So please have empathy with your people. And all of you, all Iranians globally, be kind with other Iranians that have faced persecution, whether that be Baha'is or whatever the case may be, that may have caused you to leave your country. And when you go to these countries, don't become as judgmental as whoever was judging you when you fled Iran. It's disheartening and it's disappointing because it brings a very frowned upon experience for other people that may come across Iranians and finding out that you escaped that persecution and you became equally judgmental when you got into a Western country. Keep your humanity in check at all times. And I would say to children that are at protests, be careful. I wouldn't even say go to these protests. It's not safe for you, to be at protests. And, protests, they do have influence, but I would say the best thing you can do is try to cause change from within the system in a boardroom. in a boardroom, if you get into the boardroom or if you're able to get inside the parliament or government and you can make change within, you're not met with that same aggression. When you're out in the public, you're met with the same aggression you give out. All that yelling and screaming is going to get fed back with bullets and shields. That's a very real danger. It's the same thing what's going on in America, and all these protests that have been around creating anarchy, and what Greta Thunberg does is fear-mongering for compliance.
What are these climate elites doing to all of us? Are we watching climate elites putting on theater in order to drive their personal agenda? Well, yesterday, climate activist Greta Thunberg showed up at a coal mine in Germany to protest the coal mines being put into production. She was doing this because Germany recently shut down most of its nuclear power plants in a bonehead move. So they're now turning to coal, of course. It makes no sense at all. And she's right about that. But video emerged showing Greta being dragged off by police, and she was quote unquote arrested. And then the mainstream media ran that version of the story. Oh my God, she was arrested. She's a martyr. But then a short time later, behind the scenes video emerged showing Greta taking photos with police. So was the whole thing staged? You be the judge.
Greta, it's getting quite cold in Davos. When can I expect some global warming?
Greta, would you say you're a child actor? Are you a child actor or an expert? How would you describe yourself? Greta, who was filming your arrest in Germany? Because it looked like you did that in several takes, didn't you? You were posing with the police.
It's very likely that the German police and RWE fossil fuel company would stage an arrest.
Может быть, вас разочарую, но я не разделяю общих восторгов по поводу выступления Греты Тунберг. Вы знаете, то, что молодые люди, подростки, обращают внимание на острые проблемы сегодняшнего дня, в том числе на проблемы экологии, это правильно и это очень хорошо. И их, безусловно, нужно поддержать. Но когда детей и подростков кто-то использует в своих интересах, это достойно только осуждения. Ведь никто Грете не объяснил, что современный мир сложен, многообразен, быстро развивается. И люди в Африке, либо во многих азиатских странах хотят жить на таком же уровне достатка, как и в Швеции. А как это сделать? Заставить их использовать сегодня энергию солнца, которой в Африке достаточно? Кто-нибудь объяснил, что это стоит? Но на сегодняшний день это доступная технология для развивающихся экономик и развивающихся стран. Малодоступная. Но люди хотят там жить так же, как в Швеции, и их не остановить. Пойдите, объясните им, что они должны еще прозябать в нищете лет 20-30, и их дети будут в нищете. И объясните им. В целом, конечно, мы не можем не поддержать тех идей, которые связаны с развитием возобновляемых источников энергии. Надо только исходить из реалий.
Putting out fear into the world is nasty. It's dangerous. And trying to exchange that as a barter for compliance is what happened during the pandemic. We all got put underneath fear for compliance with our ID, with our currency, with us being able to be tracked. They broke the Nuremberg Code about citizens not being forced to put inside some sort of foreign body within a human based on vaccination process because of what happened during Nuremberg trials when they forced people to become vaccinated. And if you don't understand about the Nuremberg Code, I would suggest just to Google it and look it up so you can know your rights and know what rights were violated when we were forced to all get vaccinated, whether in potentially lose your job or lose opportunities for yourself and for your family to be able to have food on the table. So there's a lot of things going on globally. So please, Iranians, be kind with each other. I know a lot of Iranian men that sort of contest any sort of outside points of view, and Iranian men are very passionate about the things that they care about, whether that's in a relationship, with love. There's a lot of emotions involved, and that might be an overall Middle Eastern thing, because they kind of liken that to the trauma Middle Eastern people faced during the Crusades, which was 300 years of killing Muslims in the name of God by the Roman Catholic Church that the Catholic Church has never apologized for. That trauma within the Middle East, they said, kind of breeded about a hostility with a lot of people that are of Middle Eastern descent and how they cope with things. So Iranian men are very passionate about things, but sometimes they're so passionate that some can be emotional where they lose their sense of logic. And whenever you put emotions over logic, it's destructive. It'll cause people to go to physically wanting to fight each other. And I believe in a true sense of masculinity, your power comes from stoicism. There was one clip that I saw that I just didn't know what to do with this.
بچه‌ها من یک سوال جدی دارم. الان نزدیک 20 روزه که در ایران تظاهراته. تا حالا هم اقلا 1000 نفرم کشتن، 20,000 نفرم بردن زندان. مهسا امینی رو فقط به خاطر روسری کشتن. شروین رو به خاطر آهنگی که ساخته انداختن تو زندان. نمیدونیم چه بلای سر اون بدبخت رو بردن به خاطر آهنگ. دانشجوها در دانشگاه ها مثل شریف رو گرفتن، کتک زدن، کشتن. از رژیم جمهور اسلامی سوال دارم. میخوام بپرسم که از مردم ایران چی میخواین شماها؟ از جون مردم دیگه چی میخواین؟ یعنی در نهایت هدفتون چیه؟ میخوای همه مردم ازت فقط بترسن منظورتونه؟ بدون که همه فقط میترسن، هیچ احترامی براتون قائل دیگه نیستش، فقط ترس. میخوای مردم همش در حال گریه و افسردگی باشن، خنده و لبخند از همه گرفته بشه، اجازه رقص و موزیک نداشته باشن؟ Seriously, shut the fuck up about روسری bro. خداییش چی میخواین شماها؟ مگه تبهکار کمیک بوکین همتون؟ از ناامیدی مردم جون میگیرین حکومت ومپایر؟ میخوای خوشحالی همه گرفته بشه؟ حال همه رو بگیرین؟ به جز خانواده های خودتون که همشون خارج از کشورن. اگر اون ایرانی که ساختین و شماها اینقدر خوبین، چرا اونا نمیمونن؟ پول مردم رو که خوردین، نفت و طلا و از هر چیزی که تونستین سوء استفاده کردین، همه چی هم فقط واسه خودتون برداشتین. مردم از گرسنگی و بی‌عدالتی دارن میمیرن. بی شرفا همه ازتون بعدشون میاد. همه یه مش آشغال و احمق و بیشور با هم ریختن. کامان برو. کشور به این قشنگی و خوبی، مردم به این زیبایی، فرهنگ شگفت انگیز و تاریخی و بهش ریدین. یعنی واقعا ریدین، از لحاظ اجتماعی، از لحاظ سیاسی، از لحاظ اقتصاد، هر جوری که تونستین ریدین به این کشور. دست از سر مردم بدبخت ما بردارین کثافتا. حالا که ریدین برین. 43 سال مردم میخوان از دست شما راحت شن. مردم میخوان باهات بریک اپ کنن، دیگه نمیخوانه. تو رو خدا برین همتون. مگه میشه همتون بیشعور باشین، دل نذاشته باشین؟ پایه هر حکومتی در اصل انتخاب مردمه. پایه هر مذهبی در اصل انتخاب مردمه. پایه انسانیت و حقوق بشری اولی انتخاب مردمه. شما فقط میخواین حق همه رو ازشون بگیرین. خب این که هدف نمیشه. اگر یکی رو باید کتک بزنی تو این آمیز باشی تا باهات بمونه، این که رابطه نمیشه، میشه تجاوز و خیانته. خاک بر سر همتون. واقعا چی میخواین شماها؟ هر چی هم که بخوای ما دیگه نمیذاریم. از این تهران تا اون تهران، زن، زندگی، آزادی.
After I saw that clip, I'm saying, how can you expect someone else from the outside to humanize with your message when you're being aggressive and you're cursing and you're calling people, you're wishing death upon people? You're almost portraying the stereotype of what they try to portray Middle Eastern people as, up to Western standards, as being potentially savages and uncivilized. Don't wish that upon your people. Wish for true positive change, but wish, your messaging needs to be grounded, and you have to maintain your masculine stoicism to just be able to see the situation from a very logical point of view and not omit history. History has a huge part to play in your country, and History is no different from you going to a doctor and asking a doctor for medical advice, and your doctor trying to diagnose you, but he didn't check your medical records to see the history of your health and the effects that have played throughout your health and things that have plagued throughout the history of your health. So that is valid.
They've continued to say that the type of uranium that they're enriching, of course, is for nuclear power.
And they are, in fact, building new power plants.
Yes.
In cooperation with Russia, which is why the United States needs to up its rhetoric around Iran enriching uranium when the data, in fact, they released the numbers just last week. They said we're enriching it to 60%. That's nowhere near needed for a weapon.
Right.
That's what's needed for power plants, which they intend to do because the Ayatollah there is a Ba'athist, and Ba'athist philosophy is energy independence inside Arab nations.
Oh, they don't want that.
Ba'athists want this.
No, I know, but the United States doesn't want
The
them
West
to be independent.
absolutely does not want
Right.
this. And in fact, Ba'athists are not really, they believe in equality for women. Because they feel like that is necessary for a modern society. That's not me saying what this Ayatollah wants. I don't know, right? But we are not usually told what their politics are. We're told it through the lens of how we need to control them.
Well, of course, and this is how the Western leaders portray Iran, right? So it's much more nuanced than they would have you believe. When you have the likes of Anthony Blinken and President Biden telling us that this regime is awful and is, the horror of the world, and you have Tony Blair, warmonger, we should all be concerned, of warmonger UK Prime Minister, former UK Prime Minister, and warmonger Tony Blair, he's been working in the shadows in Iran for quite some time to destabilize Iran with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Don't let that name fool you. They just want regime change. They want Iran wiped off the map. That's exactly what they want. Of course, they wanted Iraq wiped off the map. That's why he joined George W. Bush in doing that. And pushing anti-Iranian propaganda has been Tony Blair, completely ignoring the far larger pro-government demonstrations that have been taking place. So those have been totally ignored by the Western press. The Tony Blair Institute has been claiming that the overwhelming majority of Iranians are atheists and seeking to overthrow their Islamic government. And he keeps talking about as a scourge and evil of the world. So listening to Tony Blair and how he paints Iran.
And a conventional desire for regional hegemony. What we miss in this superficial and Western-oriented analysis is the core motivation, which was, and forever will be, the promulgation of that ideology rooted in an extreme version of Shia Islam, which is the Shia equivalent of the more radical elements of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Salafi jihadism. The internal IRGC documents which we analyze are explicit. The organization is committed to ideological political training of recruits. They proclaim an existential threat to Shiism from Sunni Arab Zionist Western axis. They mandate on religious grounds the expansion of the revolution to other nations. They authorize the killing of Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians and pressure to make them give up their devious beliefs. And they share the same litany of extremist views on social issues, including the status of women, hostility to gay people, and the sanctity of their image of Islamic society.
Now, of course, all of this may sound very familiar to you if you've been paying attention to Syria, because almost the same words. It's like right out of a playbook. Like, yeah, these are all, they hate Christians, they hate Jews, they hate all of these other people. When in fact, anyone who's lived in Syria can tell you that it was one of the most cohesive, loving places with all sorts of religions and sharing in a community until the West got involved and helped destroy that peace. So that's exactly what happens here. So is this correct, what Tony Blair is saying? Not even close, of course. He's a warmonger who's been pushing for the overthrow of this government for a long time. So you need to put it through that lens when you hear a guy like this talking, painting the whole country as extremist. Satureh Sadeghi, an Eshtefan, an Iran-based scholar and teacher, spoke recently to our friend Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone. And she says many people support the hijab and support the practice of wearing the hijab. But many Iranians oppose the morality police to enforce the wearing of the hijab. And all of this differs from province to province as you travel around Iran. Listen. Well, let's talk about Iran now, where the West continues to put pressure in trying to topple the Iranian government. My next guest says Iran is the target of a massive information war that is coordinated to push for regime change in that country. My guest is Satureh Sadeghi. She just wrote a fantastic piece for the Gray Zone called Iran's Unrest Triggers Explosion of Fake News. And journalist Sadeghi joins me now. Nice to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Nice to see you too, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So, what was the impetus for writing this piece? Obviously, you live in Tehran. You're watching all of this unfold on a regular basis. Why did you decide to tackle this subject?
Yeah, so basically, like I studied in Tehran, but now I live in Esfahan, where I was born, and I wrote that piece together with my friend, colleague, and co-host Christopher Weaver, who lives in the US. And the thing was, because I was observing everything, as you said, on a daily basis myself, things were like the things that I was seeing on Western media was like too crazy to feel anyone would believe that. But the thing is, when you live outside Iran and you don't have much access to especially Persian speakers inside Iran, it becomes very difficult to understand what is true and what is not. So Christopher helped with understanding what are the parts that the Western audience does not really understand because they don't have the information. So I tried to address some of the like craziest lies that went viral on social media that to a lot of us Iranians living here was like very, I would say, stupid and crazy to believe. But it became very important when I saw that, especially on social media, there is almost nothing or next to zero information, like authentic information about what was exactly happening inside Iran. And I felt I have to do something about this because I know that there are many people with good intentions in the West, but they do not know what exactly is happening, and some of them are worried about what's happening, and some may fall into pushing for their governments for actions that further hurts the Iranian public.
So you highlight in the piece specifically Western media outlets from the BBC to the New York Post have spun out a series of reports, I'm quoting you now, accusing Iran of killing more protesters than civilians killed by Russia in Ukraine. And a lot of this coming from think tank pundits and NATO governments. They've claimed that Tehran has sentenced 15,000 people to death simply for participating in anti-government demonstrations. That's what the West sees. What is the truth?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing is, because of, as I said, lack of information coming from inside Iran, you can say anything about Iran, and the West is going. I mean, the majority in the West are going to believe in it. And one of the, again, most outrageous things that I saw was the claim that 15,000 peaceful protesters are going to be executed in Iran. And the shocking thing for me was that, for example, Justin Trudeau of the Prime Minister of Canada, or Elijah Wood, a Hollywood celebrity, tweeted those things, and like Trudeau had to remove it, but other celebrities and social influencers did not even remove it after they found out that this was not true. So it started with kind of distorting pieces and bits of information that was available on Farsi-speaking media, and they just put together and they make speculations, and they made headlines with them. Sometimes these people maybe did not really know what was happening, but in what I was observing, it came from like, for a large part of it, as we have written about that, there were NATO allied think tanks, and there were also the MEK, which is a very notorious terrorist cult that has assassinated over 17,000 Iranians and also some Americans. So they were behind, and they knew what exactly was happening, but they had to they wanted to persuade the Western audience into pushing their governments, as I said, into taking an action against the Iranian public, for example, imposing further sanctions, or like what we saw in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, just more occupation, which brings decades of destruction and deprivation of just human rights, because when there is war, it becomes very difficult to provide basic needs for the public.
Right. So the BBC using these examples, the New York Post running with these things as well, all sorts of different Western, CNN falsely claiming that a family home of a female Iranian rock climber had been demolished as punishment for her participating without a hijab in a South Korean competition. So there's a lot of misinformation specifically around the hijab. We've covered on our show how it is the choice of many Iranian women to wear the hijab on their own terms, right? This is not. Can you talk a little bit about that disconnect, that misinformation that exists about the hijab specifically?
Yeah, I think it comes from these exceptionalist and cultural centrism mindset that things, the way people do things in the West is better and superior and more, closer to human rights observation. While there are, in different countries, people of different cultures observe their human rights and women's rights in a different way. I have actually interviewed some young university students who even took part in the legitimate protest that started just in September on my on my YouTube channel and podcast. We interviewed them, and I asked one of the protesters who was wearing the hijab more relaxed than the way I am wearing, and I asked her, if there was no mandatory hijab, would you be covering your head the same way that you are? And she was like, yes, it's not the issue for us and for many of us, even though at the same time there are women who want to have the freedom to choose what to wear, and we support them. We have, the thing that is often overlooked about Iranian women is that the majority of, for example, Iranian university students are female, something around 57%. Wow. And women are very active and outspoken in the society. They have managed to change the laws to improve it for them through parliament elections, through NGOs. There are over 2,000 NGOs that are focused on women's rights inside Iran, and they are actively working. And because, as someone who has lived here for all my life, I have taken it for granted that women can freely observe a lot of rights that they have. So it becomes very difficult for me to understand how many in the West do not understand that. Well, yeah, this is this simple form of covering, head cover or dressing, is something that you might not see very often, but it's good to ponder and pause for a second and thought, maybe this is a woman's choice too, and this is what is happening. To give an example of how this Western media works, there are so many memes on the internet about how women were free before the popular revolution that we have in 1979, whereas now they're oppressed by men because they have to cover their heads. And you see images of the women in bikini on the beaches before the revolution and women with head covers after the revolution. But what what those memes do not tell you is that, for example, the literacy rate changed from we have something close to over 90% of literacy rate now. Nobody talks about how over 90% of, for example, gynecologists in Iran are women. Nobody talks about how over 50% of university students now are women, whereas before the revolution that would never happen. So, you know, it's you take one cultural matter and you just focus on that, and then you provide an image which is totally distorted.
That's remarkable, the literacy rate that high, the changes, and specifically women in university. I didn't know those statistics. It's that's stunning. You also write in this piece, Iran is now the target of a carefully coordinated information war with a single goal: to drive international support for regime change by any means, whether through sanctions, armed insurrection, military intervention, or some combination of the three. They want Iran eliminated, basically. They want the government of Iran taken down and controlled by the West. You talk about this carefully coordinated information war. Can you talk about the coordination? Who's doing the coordination to get these fake stories out there about Iran?
Well, there was even though CNN was a big part of all these coordination campaign, they had to do an article where one cyberspace specialist studied the hashtags regarding the recent protest in Iran, and they found out that the majority of the hashtags were used by bots and trolls. And we also, in 2019, there was another analysis of those hashtags regarding protest in Iran, which showed that again, the majority of the hashtags and the Twitter accounts that were talking about the protest and posting images and news about it were coming from Albania. Most of them were based in Albania, and Albania is where this MEK cult, the terrorist cult, which used to be on EU and US list of terrorist organizations, but they had to remove it because they wanted to fund it.
Isn't that funny how it works?
Yes.
Yeah, the United States likes to fund Al Qaeda, likes to fund ISIS, and likes to fund these groups. So you can't have them be labeled terrorists. You have to take them off the list in order to fund them.
Yeah, so they found out that all these hashtags were coming from Albania, where the camp of this terrorist cult is. And it doesn't mean that before removing them from the terrorist list, they did not fund them, actually, because there is also a research by Simon Hirsch, which was, I think, published a few years ago, that during Bush administration, which is well before this organization was removed, that these MEK terrorists were trained in Nevada together with Israeli intelligence services to carry out assassinations inside Iran, and that's how they managed to assassinate an Iranian nuclear scientist. So we have lost a lot of nuclear scientists because of the US has to come up with any excuse that they can to topple the current democratic government, because before the 1979 revolution, which the Shah of Iran was one of the greatest allies of the US during the Cold War, and obviously they didn't want to lose him, but it happened, and the Iranian public pushed for the overthrow of the Shah government, and ever since they have been doing anything, including arming and supporting Saddam in his 8th war against Iran, with chemical weapons, with all sorts of weapons, and sanctioning Iran, and recently, I mean, in the recent decades or the past decade, it has been more of an information war, so that they can justify public opinion, justify their actions to the public opinion in the West.
Why does the United States, the West, find Iran so threatening?
Because, think of the West Asian region, also known as the Middle East. How many countries in this region do you know that has stood to the U.S. and its hegemony and exceptionalism, like Iran has? Like, we have paid a price. We have been under sanctions. We have been under all sorts of aggression. But even, like, the U.S. lost before the revolution. They had something around 40% of Iran oil at their hands, and now they don't have it. So why not? I mean,
Right.
and but out of all the governments in the region, the only one that you see it's still surviving, not only surviving but thriving despite all those aggression, is Iran. And Iran has also been a very strong force and support for the resistant groups, and that's why, I mean, the other nations in the region also, to a significant extent, believe that Iran's support for the resistant groups against the U.S. And Israel, especially, are very valuable to them. So. Yeah, I mean, they have tried in every possible way, and they have failed, and they want to keep trying. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, the information war continues, and again, where do you think the United States and the West will stop? Will they stop with, they started with they have the information war. Will it escalate beyond sanctions and information, and to further physical attacks? Providing rabble rousers and instigators with the means to carry out awful attacks inside of Iran beyond what we've already been seeing?
Well, I think like the U.S. wouldn't mind. There is nothing that would stop the U.S. regime from killing and occupying and massacring people. But at the same time, I think they would probably want to have some sort of a proxy war, and so that they wouldn't pay the price, but the other countries in the region would pay the price. And the Israeli lobby has played a significant role in pushing U.S.'s foreign policy, and so I think if they dare attack on Iran, because the consequences for the United States and for the Israeli regime would be really heavy. So I think they would do whatever they can not to get to that, because when you can impose sanctions and an information war, then why get involved in a military war? But I don't see anything that would strongly stop them from engaging in anything like that.
Well, information is power, and hopefully these types of stories, when we have you on our show, and hopefully people watching this video will share it out with thousands of people, because that's how we break through. That's how we break through this information, this disinformation that's being spread by these regimes, to foment discontent and create these problems. And good for you for when you and your peers and contemporaries in Iran, you see these stories, you just laugh about them, because you shake your head and say, how is this even possible? But in the West, we have a lot of work to do, right? There's a lot of ignorance around this topic. And I think, getting the message out, trying to share this is probably the best way. Am I wrong?
No, that's totally true. Like, as Julian Assange has said, if wars started with lies, then they can be stopped with telling the truth. And that's what I feel is my vision, and like a lot of other Iranians inside Iran that are trying to get their words across, despite all the censorship and everything that we see online, but we're just trying.
Yeah. Well, we will have your article linked up. I encourage all of our viewers to read the piece. It'll be linked up in the description from the Gray Zone. Great piece. Please share this video out with friends and family to spread the word about this, as we are up against an information war from the deep state. That's quite frankly who is running this thing. I really appreciate you joining us, Satara Sadeghi. Thank you so much joining us from Iran today on Redacted. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me. And if anyone wants to hear more of about Iranians, they can also take a look at the interviews that I have done with Iranians, especially Iranian women inside Iran. I think they will find it interesting.
Wonderful. And we'll link up your YouTube channel in the description as well to anyone who wants to see that. So thank you so much for that.
So you can't skip those things. No different from what they would deem that misinformation, disinformation, to not question things. You should question things, but you should also try to learn the history and not omit the history of it. And if I can take the time as an outsider to study the history of Iranians, you can do that yourself, especially if that is your people, and not try to wipe away what history, parts of history you like, what leaders you like, what leaders you don't like. Every part of it is valid, and it leads up to this point. So I love you guys. And I care for society as a whole, and I hope you receive this message well, because it comes from a very, very unique place, positive place, and I want the best for you people as Iranians. Sorry for you people. I want the best for all people in general. You people being you humans, you Iranians, and myself as African as well, and all of our globe, to have things done fairly. So, love you guys. This was a special report from Dude News, which we normally don't do. Binda is not present because I'm more versed on the subject matter, and it was something very important to me that I felt like I wanted to speak upon. So, love you guys. Yeah, and mercy. And I would tell you guys, you know, thank you so much for taking the time to just hear out what I wanted to say. And yeah, much love, guys. All right, cheers. Dudes Brewing, we're out.
Get there, but they don't make it there. You can't compare disparity sparingly. Who's prepared? Newsflash, CNN is just as bad as Fox. They coax in black emotion to coincide with a notion. They're swinging their direction instead of true self-reflection, projecting a biased view to use you for the election. We are not ex-slaves, knock the falseness off. We are survivors of the transatlantic Holocaust, African genocide that lives inside this continent. Until America can admit to that, this is the consequence. So when did racism make its cause? The term white didn't exist until miscegenation laws. Europeans were Europeans and Africans were tribal. They used two weapons, a leather whip and a Bible. It's more vital than ever for those lesser. So stop with the gimmicks that mimic our oppressor. I hate to say I told you so, but I told you so. From out the concrete, still a rose can grow. Whoa.